Throughout the years, there have been many different rivalries within the NBA, some between teams and some between individuals, but none of them have ever been as unique and as special as Magic Johnson versus Larry Bird. There are so many aspects that make their competitive rivalry a completely unique tale. For one, their rivalry started before the pros. The 1979 NCAA championship between Michigan State and Indiana State brought in a record 35.1 million viewers, making it the most watched NCAA basketball game of all time. Another unique and incredible aspect to their rivalry is the fact that they were so good immediately upon entering the NBA. Both legends began playing in the NBA in the 1979 to 1980 season, and they didn't waste any time making an immediate impact on the league. Bird had a ridiculous rookie season, averaging 21 points, 10 rebounds, 4.5 assists, and 1.7 steals, while playing all 82 games. He improved his Celtics from a 29-win team to a 61-win team in his rookie season, which is one of the greatest season-to-season turnarounds in NBA history. He was rewarded with the NBA's Rookie of the Year trophy. On the other hand, you had Magic Johnson. In his rookie campaign, he averaged 18, 8, 7, and 2.4 steals, while improving his Lakers from a 47-win team to a 60-win team. Then he simply went on to win the NBA championship and the Finals MVP at just the age of 20. This was where he famously started Game 6 at center, in place of the injured Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and had what was likely the greatest finals performance ever, as he dropped 42 points, 15 rebounds, 7 assists, and 3 steals on 61% shooting. Imagine in the modern day, two rookies in the same season, fresh after a battle in the national championship game, and one goes on to lead his team to one of the greatest turnarounds in league history, while the other leads his team to the championship, winning the Finals MVP. Social media would absolutely explode, and we would be witnessing an ESPN hype train for these two players like we've never seen before. Both players were insanely competitive. One had a flashy and attention-grabbing personality, while the other was a more introverted and blue-collar type of person. Both had a beautiful understanding of the game, with a basketball IQ that was off the charts. Both guys made their chances better by making their teammates better. From their perspective, their rivalry was intense, fierce, and obsessive. But to the audience that witnessed them, they'll tell you that it was the most beautiful basketball that they've ever seen. For an entire decade straight, at least one of them was present in the NBA Finals. Now consider the fact that these guys were the greatest rivals in basketball history, regardless of the fact that they played in separate conferences. Usually, the greatest rivalries in sports are within the same conference, because they naturally face each other more times, and the odds are greater of them crossing paths in the playoffs. But Bird and Magic were so damn good that they were able to build their all-time great rivalry as out-of-conference competitors, thanks to the fact that they kept meeting up with each other in the championship games. To put it simply, there has never been another rivalry as strong, unique, and as special as Magic versus Bird, and I'm willing to bet that we'll never, ever see another one quite like it ever again.
Larry Joe Bird, recognized by many as one of the top 10 greatest players of NBA history, but many fail to realize just how strong his GOAT argument actually is. Larry, alongside of Magic Johnson, saved the NBA and helped bring the league to new levels of popularity throughout the 1980s. Throughout Bird's illustrious career, he won 3 NBA championships, received 12 All-Star selections, made 10 All-NBA teams, won 3 MVP awards, and won 2 Finals MVP awards. Larry was also one of the most clutch players in NBA history. He had numerous game-winning shots in both regular season and the playoffs, and he was known for making the big play when his team needed it most, whether on offense or defense. As many of you already know, Bird was an all-time great three-point shooter and just a great shooter in general. He shot 37.6% from three-point range during his career, and he won the three-point shooting contest 3 consecutive years, with Craig Hodges being the only other player to win the contest that many times. Bird was a great all-around scorer and shooter when it came to efficiency, but in his prime, he was unmatched. He was the first player in NBA history to make the illustrious 50-40-90 club. To make the 50-40-90 club, a player must shoot an average of 50% from the field, 40% from three-point range, and 90% from the free throw line over an entire NBA season. In all of NBA history, only 8 players have averaged 50, 40, and 90 over a season, and of those 8 players, only Larry Bird and Steve Nash have done it multiple times. What makes Bird stand alone from Nash, though, was the fact that Bird was a scorer and a high-volume shooter. Bird shot an average of nearly twice as many shots and free throws as Steve Nash per game. Bird was a volume shooter who had multiple 50-40-90 seasons, so from that perspective, you could argue that Bird was the most overall efficient scorer in NBA history. Bird was far more than just a scorer and a shooter, though. He was one of the greatest, if not the greatest, all-around player in NBA history. Over his career, Bird efficiently averaged 24.3 points per game, 10 rebounds per game, and 6.3 assists per game. Larry was arguably the greatest passing forward of all time. His court vision, high basketball IQ, and team play was off the charts. This aspect of his game is sometimes overlooked because of the reality that he played in the same era as Magic Johnson, the face of Showtime, and arguably the greatest passer of all time. Bird wasn't quite on Magic's level in terms of vision and passing, but as far as 6'9" small forwards go, Larry was as close to Magic's passing skills as it gets. Along with his overlooked passing is his rebounding. People forget he was a 6'9" player who knew how to use his body. As I mentioned earlier, Larry averaged a whopping 10 rebounds per game over the course of his career. He wasn't just a solid rebounder, he was one of the all-time greats at it. Bird has the 49th highest career rebounds per game average in NBA history. Most of the players on that list are either power forwards or centers though, which Larry was not. He played primarily as a small forward. Among primary small forwards, Larry has the 3rd greatest rebound per game average in NBA history. These are one of those stats that testify to the hustle and heart that he played with each and every night of his career. He was also an underrated defender. Larry played with heart and effort on both sides of the basketball every game. He wasn't the greatest shot blocker, but he did average more blocks per game over his career than LeBron James has. Larry also averaged a high 1.7 steals per game over his career. He was tenacious, he was scrappy, and he was a quality on-ball defender. He also made 3 all-defense teams in his career. I'm not trying to make it seem like he was Kawhi Leonard on defense, but Larry was a good defender who often doesn't get the recognition he deserves in that area. Larry was a legend and a leader who impacted the game in just about every way you can, and as a result, his team won 3 championships and made a trip to the finals 5 times. An aspect that I don't often hear mentioned in the GOAT discussion was the fact that Magic was a rival to Bird, and Bird was a rival to Magic. In a way, you could say that these 2 legends took away from each other's success. Michael Jordan, for example, had no equal throughout the 90s, so in a way, it's easier for us to call him the GOAT since he so clearly stood out from everyone else. If you take either Magic or Bird out of the equation though, the remaining player stands out that much more. Magic would have won more championships if Larry wasn't around, and Larry would have won more championships if Magic wasn't around. Although you could argue that their impacts and legacies were greater since they were rivals to each other, we can also acknowledge that their GOAT pursuits were hindered by the fact that they were constantly in each other's way. Bird had many obstacles and challenges, but he didn't let that stop him from putting together an impressive, all-around GOAT-worthy career. But with all of that being said, there is one aspect of Bird's career that is more legendary, more jaw-dropping, and more GOAT-worthy than any other aspect of his remarkable career. In the year 1985, Bird was at home with his mother and was wanting to help her build her new driveway. While Bird was out there shoveling gravel for his mom, something happened that would change the rest of his career. Bird brutally injured his back, which would then be an ongoing battle with pain and spasms for the rest of his career. This injury speaks to Larry's pride, hard work, and independence. What's crazy is that I'm pretty sure any Bostonian in that day would have volunteered to shovel that gravel for Larry. Regardless, the damage was done, and ultimately these back issues would play a part in Bird leaving the game earlier than many other athletes. With that being said, this injury begun and took place in 1985. Bird still played 7 seasons after that injury. Listen to Larry's primary doctor describe what Larry was dealing with through those final 7 seasons of his career.
He could manage the pain in a way that very few people can do. There'd be days he could come in the office and he couldn't stand up straight. It was a situation that he was seeing almost daily. He had lost the structural stability in his spine, so it would slip into abnormal positions to try and lock itself to get an artificial stability. That's like getting your finger stuck in a door and somebody's still pushing on the door. So what we had to do was unlock his spine, realign it, do techniques that would hold that for 4 hours, 6 hours, that type of thing, and then he'd go play basketball. His pain in his quest for basketball became all-encompassing. Very few people really knew what Larry was living with.
So let me get this straight. When Larry had won his championship and finals MVP in 1986, this is what he was going through? In 87 and 88, when Larry had back-to-back 50, 40, 90 seasons while averaging nearly 30 points per game, this was the back issues he pushed through? When Larry won the league MVP award in 1986, which was his 3rd MVP in a row, which he is the only player to ever accomplish since the NBA's merger, this is what he overcame to get it done? That is beyond legendary. It's utterly ridiculous. You do realize that Larry only played 5 healthy seasons in his career before he received what many people would consider a career-ending injury, and then spent more than half of his career dealing with the pain and structural damage, and yet he still managed to put together a GOAT-worthy resume. No other NBA legend has anything close to that kind of claim. Say what you want about Larry Bird, but the reality is, he's likely the toughest and baddest dude the NBA has ever seen.
Earvin Magic Johnson, recognized by most as the greatest point guard of NBA history. He was a 12-time All-Star, he made 10 All-NBA teams, he was a 3-time League MVP, 3-time Finals MVP, and a 5-time NBA champion. Magic was known for his remarkable leadership and his extremely unselfish approach to the game. He has the greatest assists per game average in NBA history at 11.2, ahead of John Stockton. Besides Magic and Stockton, no other player in NBA history averaged 10 assists or more for his career. He was just so far ahead of his time. He was a 6'9" giant point guard with the greatest court vision imaginable, who always wanted to push the tempo the instant his Lakers secured the rebound. Earvin Johnson was his birth name, but he earned the name Magic with his incredibly fast, flashy, and mesmerizing style of play. Magic is the definition of a player who makes his teammates better. Every teammate on the court had to be alert at all times because you never knew when Magic would find you, creating an easy scoring opportunity for you. I've actually seen people online criticize Magic for averaging just short of 20 points per game over his career, which to me is a silly criticism, considering that Magic has easily the highest assist per game average of all time. Of the top 10 players with the highest assist per game average in NBA history, Magic has the second highest scoring average among those players, behind only Oscar Robertson. Magic was also a clutch performer. Sure, he had his shortcomings and briefly had the nickname Tragic Johnson for his failures in the 1984 NBA Finals, but he easily redeemed himself from that, and beyond all of that are all the historic clutch moments and game winners of his career. From the baby skyhook in the 1987 Finals to his performance in the 1980 Finals. Speaking of the 1980 NBA Finals, if LeBron thinks that one significant series is enough to make his claim as the GOAT, then Magic has this one game to make his claim as the GOAT. Magic Johnson's rookie season was incredible. As a rookie, he averaged 18 points, over 7 rebounds, and 7 assists. It wasn't his numbers that made this season so legendary though, it was what he did on the NBA's biggest stage. I'm sure most of you know this story already,
but the Lakers were in a hard-fought NBA Finals against the talented Julius Erving-led Philadelphia 76ers. In Game 5 of the NBA Finals, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar sprained his ankle and would not play again for the rest of the series. The Lakers were shorthanded and decided to start Magic Johnson at center for the 6th game of the series. Wrap your head around this for a second. Magic was the Lakers' starting point guard throughout the season, and as a 20-year-old rookie, he was tasked with starting in place of the great Kareem at center. What Magic did next sounds like it came straight from an over-the-top sports movie script. Magic dominated the game, playing at the center, forward, and guard positions at different points in the game based on whatever the Lakers needed on their lineup situations. The Lakers won the game 123-107, and Magic's final stat line was 42 points, 15 rebounds, 7 assists, and 3 steals. It was the definition of a clutch performance. Magic is still the only rookie in NBA history to win the Finals MVP award. Magic is also one of only 4 players to win the NCAA championship and the NBA championship in consecutive years. Imagine any rookie in this year's draft class doing what Magic did, starting the year as a perimeter player and then stepping in at center in the clinching Game 6 of the NBA Finals, dropping 42, 15, and 7. The internet would explode, and media would be declaring him the next GOAT before he's even played a game in his sophomore season. It sounds impossible to even fathom, but that's what Magic Johnson did before many of us were even born to appreciate it. This was just the beginning of Magic's illustrious career and of his dominance over the NBA. Magic played in only 12 seasons in the NBA before he announced his retirement due to the HIV virus he obtained. Magic Johnson went to the NBA Finals in 9 of those 12 seasons in the league. That is astonishingly efficient. He can easily be seen as the standard of NBA excellence due to this. How many other legends can say that they led their team to the finals 75% of the time in their career? Even Jordan, LeBron, and Kobe aren't even close to that level of efficiency. Magic, unfortunately, doesn't have longevity working in his favor. His all-time statistics were cut short, along with his achievements and accolades. Yet despite all of that, Magic still put a GOAT-worthy resume together in the short time he was in the NBA. When Magic's career came to an abrupt end because of the HIV virus, he was still an MVP candidate and still far from the end of his elite status. He was only 31 years old. He was at his career average of almost 20 points a game. He was second in the league in assists at 12.5 per game. He was a back-to-back MVP winner just a year prior, and he just led his Lakers to the NBA Finals only 2 seasons after the retirement of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Magic wasn't just great when his career was cut short, he was likely still the best point guard in the game and a top 3 player in the league. To further drive home the point, I want you to imagine if other NBA legends had their careers cut short as early as Magic's was, and think of how that affects their legacies. Dirk Nowitzki would no longer be an NBA champion. LeBron James would never have won his amazing championship in Cleveland. Shaq would have 3 titles instead of 4, Duncan would have 4 titles instead of 5, and Michael Jordan would have only 3 titles instead of 6. Beyond just all of the lost championships are all of the lost stats, MVPs, All-NBA appearances, and just accolades overall. There was truly a second half of Magic's career that unfortunately we never got to witness. No one ever talks about this aspect, but imagine if Magic never got HIV and had a career that lasted as long as other legends like Kobe, Duncan, Kareem, or LeBron, just to name a few. If that had been the case, Magic could have spent his final few years of his career playing alongside of a young Shaq and Kobe. Are you kidding me? I understand that in all of these what-if scenarios, there's the whole butterfly effect, and that if this what-if actually happened, it could have changed the entire league as we know it with all of its ramifications. With that being said, Shaq signed with the Lakers in free agency. That's still something that could have easily happened even if Magic Johnson was around. Kobe also wasn't drafted by the Lakers, so draft position didn't really matter. He was scouted by the brilliant Jerry West, who fell in love with the young prospect and traded for Kobe. Even with Magic Johnson still around in the twilight of his career, both of those moves could have still easily taken place. How does this change Magic's legacy if he's adding titles alongside of Kobe and Shaq to end his career? Now let me be clear, I'm not saying we should give credit to Magic for stuff that didn't actually happen, but what I am doing is trying to show the impact that longevity can have on a player's career and legacy. I'm also trying to bring an appreciation to what Magic was able to accomplish in far less time than just about every other legend of NBA history. If you want a player who's the definition of making his teammates better, Magic Johnson is your choice. If you want a legend who's leading his team to be title contenders for his entire career, then Magic is your guy. If you want a GOAT who saved the NBA, changed the way the game is played, and put on a show while doing it, then Magic Johnson is the man you're looking for.
Let me first clarify, you saw what the video title is, but what may be an even more descriptive title would be NBA series that determine the pecking order. What I essentially mean is specific playoff series in NBA history that went a certain way. But if it had gone differently, then it would have completely switched the all-time rankings of the two superstars involved. To me, this video is a very simple concept, but it's also a fascinating topic, because it really shows you the significance of each playoff series and of each individual game, and sometimes of even one shot. In one evening, a player's legacy can be completely altered for decades to come, simply based on how he performs against the other star on that specific night. Hopefully, this all makes sense, but if not, you'll get it by the end of the first segment. So without further ado, let's get into it. First off, Larry Bird and Magic Johnson in the 1987 NBA Finals. This was the third time that these two rivals met up in the finals during the 1980s, and it was massive in terms of bragging rights, because the winner of that series was taking a 2-championships-to-1 lead in those 80s matchups. Well, as you all know, Magic Johnson and the Lakers went on to defeat the Celtics in 6 games. Magic put up monstrous averages, was the finals MVP, and even had the iconic game-winning hook shot in Game 4. But even more significant than that was the fact that Magic secured his 5th championship ring compared to Bird's 3. And one of the lasting images from that battle was when Larry was in a press conference after suffering defeat, and admitted that he believed Magic Johnson was simply the better player.
Magic's just a great basketball player. He's the best I've ever seen, you know. Unbelievable. I don't know what to say.
Now, over 3 decades later, Magic Johnson is usually recognized as the player who's higher on the all-time list. But I honestly believe that all changes if the Celtics had won the series. Think about it. Larry Bird was leading Magic in MVP awards at that point 3-2, and Bird had just won 3 out of the last 4 MVP awards. Many people were already thinking that Larry was the better individual player. If the Celtics had won, Magic would have just 4 championships to Larry Bird's 4, and Bird would then also have the edge in Finals MVPs 3-2. Beyond that, Bird would have the last laugh, defeating Magic 2 out of the 3 times that they met on the game's biggest stage. Not only was this one series so massive, but you could even argue that the legacies were defined on the last shot of Game 4. If Bird buries that game winner, then the Celtics would have had a commanding 3-2 lead by the end of Game 5. But alas, he missed the shot, and the Lakers went on to close out the series soon afterwards. This whole thing really gives you some perspective on just how closely competitive their rivalry truly was. Last on the list is Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson in the 1991 NBA Finals. This was a highly anticipated and extremely hyped matchup between the guy seen as the face of the league and the guy seen as the future face of the league. When it comes down to it, Jordan and the Bulls simply had the better roster, as they closed out the series in just 5 games. Not only do I believe that this series would have shifted their rankings if it had gone differently, but I believe it would have them completely switch places as to who's widely recognized as the greatest player of all time. You need to understand, the Lakers didn't win this series and they should not have won this series. Magic no longer had the assistance of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who had retired somewhat recently. On top of that, Magic's Lakers were shorthanded, as his two best scoring weapons, James Worthy and Byron Scott, both missed significant time in the finals due to injuries. Even against all odds, if Magic somehow won the title instead of Jordan, it would give Magic 6 rings to Jordan's 5, and it would be the lasting image of Magic's career that he bested Jordan in his final season, in a series that he wasn't supposed to win. For MJ, it would have been a whole new damning narrative, that he was never able to win until Magic allowed him to by retiring. People would be saying that Magic was the face of the 80s and he could have been the face of the 90s if he didn't get HIV. From that perspective, in that reality, I don't see how anyone could have comfortably referred to Michael Jordan as the greatest player of all time when Magic Johnson had that as his legacy.
Bird shoot left-handed for an entire game against Portland?
Scoring 47 points. You're especially using your left hand.
Oh.
I remember because I was there, and it was at a time when McHale was still coming off the bench, so he scored the first 8 points of the game left-handed.
I had a good left hand around the basket, and they always, if you watch, if I remember the game correctly, they were forcing me left to help, and they wasn't getting there quick enough, so I had shots around 5-6 foot with my left hand. I felt more comfortable with my left hand there than I did my right. Then once I got started making a few, I just kept going.
And Jerome Kersey was guarding him at the time, and I remember this because we had a great trash-talking team. I mean, we had ML Carr, we had McHale, we had Bird. Ainge was a yacker. I mean, we had guys with great creativity with that. And I'll never forget it. McHale yells out, "Hey, Jerome, wait till you start shooting right-handed."
Some night it goes in, some night it don't. That night it happened to work out. But if I remember correctly, we won that game in overtime by like 1 point. So, probably shot with my right hand the whole game.
Now, anyone who considers themselves a Larry Bird fan is well acquainted with this story. But just how accurate is their telling of this story? Well, usually, this is the part of the video where I do the investigative work to find out when this game took place. But in this case, I didn't have to do that, as the NBA's official YouTube page has the highlights of the game and posted the specific date of the contest in the video's description. The game occurred on February 14th, 1986, which just happened to be Valentine's Day, and it was a regular season matchup between the 39-9 Celtics and the 29-26 Portland Trailblazers. Bird and the Celtics were on the second night of a back-to-back after beating the Supersonics in Seattle the previous evening. Even with their tired legs, the Celtics had plenty of reasons to be confident. For one, they had the best record in the entire league, and in the Eastern Conference, they were a whopping 9 games ahead of second place in the loss column. So in short, the Celtics were not just a confident team, but they were supremely confident, and no one more so than their superstar leader, Larry Bird, who was on the verge of winning his 3rd straight MVP award. Considering the fact that it was mid-February and the team was coasting to the 1st seed, it would make sense that Bird and the Celtics would be looking for ways to challenge themselves. So according to Bird's teammate at the time, Bill Walton, Larry told the team well before tip-off that he was going to play the entire contest with just his left hand, or at least the first 3 quarters. Now, although the Celtics were good, this was still an extremely ballsy move from Larry, considering how the Celtics were 22-1 at home up until that point, and the only team that managed to beat them in their building was this same Portland Trailblazers team. On top of that, Boston's second best player, Kevin McHale, was going to miss this game with an injury. So more so than usual, you would think Larry Bird would need his dominant hand to win this matchup. Regardless, Bird felt confident enough to proceed with his left-handed plan. When the game started, you could immediately tell how Larry was operating with the left side of his brain, as his first contribution was a left-handed blocked shot on Kiki Vanderway. Back on offense, Larry pump faked and then converted a running left-handed floater. Soon after that, he spun around Jerome Kersey for his second left-handed field goal, but that one was thanks mostly to the atrocious defensive effort from Kersey. His next basket was a breakaway bucket that he flushed down with his right hand. So at this point, it's pretty clear that the entire game wasn't with his left hand. His next few baskets were mostly jumpers converted with his right hand. Then he went back to alternating between his right and his left hand, depending on where he was at on the court. Now, despite Bird continuing to go to work, the game was remaining close throughout, thanks to the strong offensive performances from Portland's Vanderway and Jerome Kersey. At halftime, the game was tied at 55 points. At this point, you would think that the score being this close would make Bird switch back to exclusively using his right hand, but that wasn't the case. Sure, he continued to shoot jumpers with his dominant hand, but in the post, Larry was using his craftiness and intelligence to position himself to score with his left, which he did time and time again. To start the fourth quarter, Larry did an up and under move to hit this mid-range shot with his left. And now, the Portland crowd seemed frustrated as they booed the Celtics star for the fact that he was toying with the Blazers. Now the left-handed onslaught was in full effect, as he hit this running hook over Clyde Drexler, followed by this ridiculous and one shot on Drexler as well. It wasn't until this point in the game, where Larry had scored his 39th point, that he was finally ready to abandon his left-handed approach, presumably for the sake of guaranteeing the victory. With about 15 seconds remaining in regulation, Boston finds themselves trailing by just 2 points. Bird gets the ball from DJ and hits this clutch jumper to tie the game at 109, which ultimately sent the game to overtime. Later in OT, it's down to the final possession once again, but this time, Portland is leading by just 1 point, 119 to 118, and Bird is the man inbounding the ball with just 17 seconds left on the clock. At this point in the game, Bird was sitting on a 45-point triple-double, where he had just done most of his damage with his left hand. So obviously, Portland was going to do everything in their power to deny him the ball. So now, Larry Legend inbounds the ball to Robert Parrish. He has to fight through physical defense from Kersey, but he eventually gets the rock back. And then, despite the defense being right on him, Bird did what Bird does, as he hit the game-winning shot with 3 seconds remaining, capping off one of the most amazing regular season performances in Celtics history. He finished with 47 points, 14 rebounds, and 11 assists on 21 of 34 shooting. He only took a total of 3 free throws throughout the entire game, as he basically earned everything he did from the field. Now here's the important detail of the story. Of Larry Bird's total of 21 field goals made, 10 of them were made with his left hand, while the other 11 field goals were made with his right hand. So in conclusion, no, he did not play the entire game with his left hand, but he did play a large portion of that game with his left hand, in a situation where he knew he was going to be leaned upon heavily offensively. No matter how you slice it, this was a remarkable game by Bird, and it's since been properly immortalized in basketball lore.
I want you to go back. I want you to go deep into time. Okay. You and Larry Bird, teammates for a long time. What's your best Larry Bird story?
I think the story that sums up Larry the best was back then when we flew commercial, we didn't fly private. We played in a Tuesday night game in Cleveland. And of course, we got up for the first flight out. We had a game on Wednesday night in New Jersey. Snowstorm hits Cleveland. We're at the airport at 7 in the morning. Flight's canceled at 7. It's canceled at 8. It's canceled at 9. It's canceled at 10. Canceled at 11, 12. We finally leave about 1:30 or 2 in the afternoon. We fly up to New Jersey. Now the storm has kind of moved into Jersey. And the bus driver says, well, I can't get to the hotel and to the arena. I can only go to one place. Well, we had a game that night. We go to the arena. So we get to the arena, and I mean, we're dragging. And we're sitting on the locker room, and, and everybody's kind of, we're tired. And, and all of a sudden, the coach gives a little bit of a speech of, come on, man, guys, we're playing basketball. Let's get ready to go. And Larry stands up, and Larry says,
a couple other few choice words, and he says, I don't know about you guys, but I'm going to take it out on their rear ends. So I was like, oh, all right, so let's go. So we go on the floor. Albert King sitting there, and Larry walks up to Albert King and goes, don't take this butt whooping personally. I've been eating hot dogs all day. And then Albert King looks at him like, you've been eating hot dogs all day? What's that got to do with me? And we went out and just hammered him. I mean, we terrorized them. And that was Larry. There was no excuses. I mean, he just played. And I tell you, that was just his competitive nature. But a day when you fly all day and eat hot dogs in the airport, best thing was Albert's look on his face like, what hot dogs got to do with me?
So here's the thing. I did the research, and this never took place exactly the way that Kevin McHale described it. This isn't necessarily a surprise, because when older retired players are talking about past memories that took place decades ago, it's understandable that some of the details get lost or embellished over time. Here's what you need to know. During Larry Bird and Kevin McHale's careers as teammates, they never once played in Cleveland and then in New Jersey on back-to-back nights. So some of the details of this story must be incorrect, considering how he name-dropped specifically Albert King of the New Jersey Nets on the second night of the back-to-back, and since that was the player that Bird trash-talked to, that is probably the team that is correct in this story. Now, Albert King played for the New Jersey Nets from the 1981-82 season through the 1986-1987 season. So that is the 6-season stretch that I started researching. In that specific time frame, the Celtics played in New Jersey on the second night of a back-to-back a total of 6 times. In those 6 instances, the Celtics lost to the Nets twice. In 3 of those 6 instances, the New Jersey game was preceded by a Celtics home game. So according to McHale, the games took place on back-to-back nights. Both games were road games. They were up against Albert King and the New Jersey Nets on the second night of a back-to-back, and the games occurred on a Tuesday and a Wednesday night. Literally, only one instance in NBA history fits this description. And because of this, I believe I found the games that Kevin McHale was talking about. It was a back-to-back matchup with the Milwaukee Bucks and the New Jersey Nets that began on December 3rd, 1985, which does match McHale's claim of the games occurring during the winter season. The first game was a matchup with a strong Milwaukee Bucks squad, loaded with stars like Sidney Moncrief, Terry Cummings, and Paul Pressey. The Bucks had a solid 15-6 record, while the Celtics were bolstering a league-best 15-2 record. On the first night of a back-to-back, it was actually Kevin McHale who stood out with a dominant performance, as he dropped 29 points, 10 rebounds, 4 assists, 2 steals, and 5 blocks, on a tremendous 11 of 16 shooting from the field. Meanwhile, Bird was being guarded by the lockdown defender Sidney Moncrief, and as a result, he didn't have his best performance, as he finished with 18 points, 9 rebounds, 5 assists, and 5 turnovers, on 8 of 18 shooting. Regardless, the Celtics finished the game strong, and won this epic battle of Eastern Conference contenders with a final score of 112-109. But this is when the story started to become interesting and unique. According to McHale, the Celtics were sleep-deprived, they were physically exhausted, they were frustrated with all the flight delays, they were uncomfortable from riding coach, and now they had to play the second night of a back-to-back against a playoff-bound New Jersey Nets team, who had star players like Otis Birdsong, Michael Ray Richardson, and Buck Williams. After a miserable evening, morning, and afternoon of eating awful airport hot dogs, Bird was ready to execute his wrath on Albert King and the New Jersey Nets. Now, based on McHale's explanation of the story, you would think that Bird just exploded for about 50 points or so, while being loaded up on nasty hot dogs. But that actually wasn't the case, if this game was in fact the game he was talking about. If anything, it was quite the team effort, as Bird was 4th on the team in scoring as he dropped 18 points, 3 rebounds, and 5 assists on 8 of 16 shooting. The Celtics seemed to be motivated and angry as a squad,
as Danny Ainge scored 26 points, Dennis Johnson had 23 points, and Kevin McHale had 22 points. As a whole, Boston shot a ridiculous 62.2% from the field over the course of the game, and due to this, New Jersey simply couldn't keep up, as the Celtics won every quarter, finishing the game with a victorious final score of 130 to 111. And I'm sure the Celtics finally proceeded to have a good night's sleep. Ultimately, I can't say with absolute 100% certainty that this was the game that McHale was describing, but based on all of the evidence he provided, this is at least a pretty safe bet. At the end of the day, this performance wasn't quite as dominant as we were led to believe it was for Larry Bird. But if anything, it remains as a funny and triumphant story of a team channeling their anger and frustration towards success. If you go online and search around social media, you'll quickly find out that Steph Curry has so many fans. It's very understandable. The guy is the greatest shooter that the game of basketball has ever seen. He spaces the floor like no one else has before, and with him leading the way, he has pushed the NBA into a new era, focused almost entirely on three-point shooting. He's also a 6'3" player who isn't an athletically gifted freak like many modern-day superstars. Yet he still finds a way to be an elite ball player year in and year out. Many people find this quality admirable. No matter how you slice it, Steph has firmly established himself as one of the greatest basketball players to ever live. Now with that being said, many of his fans online, many modern athletes, and much of the mainstream media are anxious to put him into the top spot of the greatest point guards of all time. And my response to that is,
stop it. Get some help.
It's not that I think Steph isn't on his way to the top. He's still very elite, and by the end of his career, he might just be the consensus pick over Magic Johnson. But in my opinion, this is the perfect example of recency bias, and way too many people being a slave of the moment. It's so premature to already put him in the top spot, but many people forget just how dominant Magic Johnson was in such a short period of time. Unlike many of today's modern legends, Magic wasn't blessed with a long and healthy career. In 1991, he shook the world with his announcement that he had obtained HIV. You need to understand, when Magic played his last game before that announcement, he was only 31 years old. Think about other NBA greats if they retired at that same age. Dirk Nowitzki would no longer be an NBA champion. LeBron James would only have 2 rings instead of 4, Shaq would have 3 titles instead of 4, Duncan would have 4 titles instead of 5, Michael Jordan would only have 3 titles instead of 6, and Steph Curry would only have 3 titles instead of 4. Magic Johnson had 5 championship rings when he had to retire at such an early age, and there was still a second half of his career in store that we never got to witness. Who knows, Magic may have ended up with 7 or 8 championships if he wasn't forced to retire early. Now don't get me wrong, my point isn't to give Magic credit for things that he actually didn't accomplish. But what you certainly can't argue is the fact that Magic built a GOAT candidate resume in roughly half the time that it took everyone else to build theirs. Also consider this. In the last 2 seasons leading up to that retirement, Magic was the league MVP in 1990, and he was the MVP runner-up in 1991. In Game 5 of the 91 Finals, which was the last game of that season, Magic had 16 points, 20 assists, and 11 rebounds. He got 20 assists in a finals game, while his 2 best scoring options were out with injuries, which were James Worthy and Byron Scott. Not only were there no signs of him slowing down, but you could argue that he was just as good as ever. Steph has already significantly passed Magic in seasons played, yet he's still trying to catch him in terms of every major accolade, including MVPs, championships, finals MVPs, and all NBA teams. This is because Magic was incredible from the start of his career until the very end.
The greatest playoff performance in NBA history was when a 20-year-old rookie guard replaced an injured Kareem Abdul-Jabbar at center and won the championship-clinching 6th game with a total of 42 points, 15 rebounds, 7 assists, and 3 steals on 61% shooting. And what people often fail to consider is how a rookie Magic did that against the Philadelphia 76ers, who were the #1 ranked defense that season. That was Magic's impact in his first season. While on the other hand, Steph Curry wasn't even considered as an elite player in the league until his 4th or 5th season. Again, I just can't emphasize enough how Magic didn't have the luxury of a full career like many other greats did. John Stockton was another great point guard from Magic Johnson's era, and he played 19 seasons in the NBA. Magic only played 12 seasons before HIV caused him to retire. If he had a career as long as the other greats I previously mentioned, then he would have been competing for championships alongside of Shaquille O'Neal and Kobe Bryant in the twilight of his career. In Magic's 12 seasons before the announcement, he made it to the NBA Finals 9 out of those 12 seasons. And in the entire Western Conference, he finished the highest in the MVP race 9 seasons straight. That is dominance. If we're being honest, that's a level of individual dominance that Steph Curry can only dream of, as his longest streak was just 2 seasons. Now, some Steph Curry fans will argue in his favor, saying that Steph changed the game with his 3-point shooting, and thus did something that no other great has ever done before. I'm gonna be honest, I hate this argument so deeply, because it isn't nearly as unique as they make it seem. When you narrow down the list of the top 10 greatest players of all time, nearly every one of them did something that completely changed basketball. For example, Michael Jordan made the game global. Larry Bird and Magic Johnson literally saved the NBA in the 1980s. Wilt Chamberlain changed the rulebook because of his dominance, as the league office was looking for ways to slow him down and balance the league. Bill Russell won more championships than any other player in NBA history. Other than Bill Russell, the longest streak of championships by a player is 3 straight rings. Bill doubled that and then added 2 more on top of it. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar uniquely dominated the league, as he introduced the most indefensible shot of all time, the skyhook. In the history of the game, no player has ever had an entire conference gearing up to stop him like Shaquille O'Neal did in the early 2000s. I could keep going, but as you can see, many all-time greats have done things that have changed the game. So Curry fans saying, "My boy changed the game with his shooting," isn't swaying anything when you're looking at the select few greatest players of all time. Earlier I mentioned how mainstream media is already pushing this narrative. One of those people is Colin Cowherd, who claims that Steph Curry has already surpassed Magic Johnson, due mostly to the fact that Steph is a great shooter and Magic is not. I'm not gonna lie, this is one of the dumbest arguments you could possibly make when comparing greats. Holding past legends to the standard of what makes players great in the modern game is ridiculously biased and seems desperate for a hot take. If you went back in time and during the 1980s you told Magic Johnson he wasn't the best point guard because he couldn't shoot from the perimeter, he would probably say, "What the hell does that have to do with me winning a championship?" Magic was the guy who found his shooters, like Michael Cooper and Byron Scott. And at that time, that era wasn't defined by screens and 3-point shooting, but it was defined by fast break transitional basketball, which no one was better at than Magic. None of those stars in the 80s gave a damn about winning a hypothetical horse competition with players from the future. They were trying to win championships in that era based on the style of that era, and clearly Magic was very good at doing that, which should be what truly matters. Now listen, this video is not intended to come across as a Steph Curry slander video. My only point is that people are young and overreactive sometimes, and they're prematurely trying to put him in a spot that currently belongs to someone else. As of now, Magic has the edge in dominant consistency, championships, and individual accolades. I just don't see an angle where you can legitimately elevate Steph Curry above him at this current time. With that being said, Steph isn't showing any signs of slowing down either, and shooting ability is one of the skills that age the most gracefully in the NBA, so you would be foolish to say that it's impossible for him to pass Magic at some point in the future. As in the case of most things, time will tell. So what do you guys think? Am I wrong? Has Steph already passed Magic as the greatest point guard of all time? And if he hasn't, what would he have to do in order to secure the #1 spot? Let me know in the comments section below. Earvin Magic Johnson, one of the greatest players in NBA history, and many people still believe he's the greatest point guard of all time. Magic obviously had a historic beginning to his career, but what I believe isn't talked about enough is the iconic farewell to his NBA career, which was a roller coaster of emotions for the basketball community, finishing off with a satisfying ending that I personally will never forget. In order to understand the impact of Magic's beautiful moment, we first have to understand his journey to get there. Let's go all the way back to early June of 1991. At this time, Magic Johnson is just 31 years old. He's the runner-up for the league MVP, and he was the MVP in the previous season. He's coming off of a regular season where he averaged nearly 20 points and 12.5 assists, and he's about to make his 9th NBA Finals appearance as a 5-time NBA champion. To summarize it all, Johnson had just entered his early 30s and appeared to be every bit as good as he ever was before. Even without the recently retired Kareem Abdul-Jabbar as a teammate, Johnson was still able to lead his Lakers to the NBA Finals yet again. He had already built a resume worthy of being called the greatest point guard ever, and he seemingly still had a second half of his career ahead of him. When the 1991 Finals began, Magic was going toe-to-toe with the prime Michael Jordan. And although Michael ended up being the Finals MVP, Magic displayed a remarkable effort of his own. Many people believe that the Lakers never really had a true opportunity in this series, since Magic's two best scoring options, James Worthy and Byron Scott, both dealt with injuries throughout and missed a significant amount of time. Even without his two best weapons in the elimination game, Magic still put up 16 points, 20 assists, and 11 rebounds. What he didn't realize, and what none of the audience had realized either, is that this would be his last NBA Finals game of his entire career. Because a few months later, on November 7th, 1991, Magic held one of the most shocking press conferences in the history of sports. It was at this moment that the world became aware that the face of the Showtime Lakers was now HIV positive. At the time, little was known about the disease, so the assumption from almost everyone was that in a matter of months, he would lose a tremendous amount of weight and then pass away. Along with the horrific news of Magic's health, he also made it aware to the world that he was retiring from the Lakers, effective immediately. Imagine your favorite basketball player being at the peak of his abilities, and in a matter of seconds, he goes from one of the best players in the game to a retired player who could pass at any moment. Needless to say, this was a jarring pill to swallow for basketball fans, as seemingly everyone had their hearts broken for Magic on that day. Over the next several months and years, people would begin to learn a lot about living with HIV and the various details, like how it's transmitted and who's at risk. But many were still scared about the idea of being in contact with someone who had it. Then, in February of 1992, things got really interesting for Johnson and the basketball world. The NBA All-Star Game is an exhibition event where the fans vote and determine who will play for each conference. Despite the fact that Magic had retired from basketball, the fans still voted him in to be the starting point guard of the Western All-Stars. After receiving approval from doctors and from the league for Magic to play, the hype train was officially underway. The thing is, not everyone was so enthusiastic. Many players were concerned about their own well-being. Even Magic's former teammates like Byron Scott and AC Green said that he shouldn't participate.
The player who was the most vocal about his displeasure with Magic competing was the Western Conference All-Star Karl Malone, who had this to say before the game was played.
If I get in a collision with a guy, it don't have to be Magic. It can be Joe Smoke. But the fact of the matter is, if you got the AIDS virus, it'll be hard for me to play as hard as I'm capable of playing.
Although there was plenty of drama heading into that night, there was also plenty of teammates and competitors who encouraged Magic to participate. Just as a spectator, you could tell that there was this awkward, unspoken tension in the air, but you could also sense the excitement and the magnitude of the moment, as the Orlando crowd gave Johnson a standing ovation during player introductions. Everyone understood that the ideal outcome was the West winning and Magic securing the All-Star Game MVP. But regardless of how badly the crowd wanted that, he still had to go out there and perform well. Seeing that Magic hadn't played a game in nearly a year, and seeing how he was now dealing with a life-altering disease, many people were concerned that he wouldn't have the conditioning or stamina to hang with the best players in the world. But all of those concerns were quickly put to rest soon after tip-off commenced. Although he built a legacy for himself as mainly a distributor, Magic was looking to score early on, and he did so with tremendous efficiency. Throughout the night, the West played with more energy and effort, and a 10-point lead quickly became a 20-point lead, and then a 20-point lead suddenly became a 30-point lead. The outcome was never really in question, but the MVP of the game appeared to be up for grabs, and the Western Conference's Clyde Drexler appeared to be the favorite heading into the second half with a monstrous stat line. After looking to score for a while, Magic finally got his first assists of the game with just under 9 minutes left in the third quarter, and then he got on a roll with his flashy Showtime passes that we were accustomed to. With less than 3 minutes left in the game, Magic suddenly hit the switch and displayed one of the most beautiful finishes in All-Star Game history. Just so you can sense the gravity and energy of this inspiring moment, I'll let you guys watch the final sequences of this game with no voiceover, and please pay attention to how Magic was at the center of it all.
135-106. With 2:46 to go, no doubt about this one.
There it is. There's the three.
Magic got his three.
Waiting for that moment to shoot the three.
Who has all the NBA three-point marks, most attempts, most made. Johnson, 2 in a row for Magic. He's going for the MVP. The Atlanta Hawk has 8. Chris Mullin for 3. It's out shooting the East in every quarter. And will be around the 60% mark, and another great pass. And Marley has his first points. Magic raises his. Well, this is a mismatch, and Magic would be the first to admit it. Michael Kind.
And that's 2, Magic said. Bring the next one on.
6, 5, three-pointer. Yes! Oh, my! Ladies and gentlemen, you just can't orchestrate it better than that.
When Magic hit that final falling away three-pointer, there was still 15 seconds left on the clock. Yet no one on the court seemed to even care, as they all surrounded and congratulated the Lakers legend. The game ended on the spot. It was a perfectly fitting and poetic way for the game to end, with a Magic Johnson jumper. Any question of who was the game's MVP now had an obvious answer, as Magic finished the game with 25 points, 9 assists, 5 rebounds, and 2 steals on 75% shooting. What started as a somewhat dramatic and awkward event ended up as one of the most uniting and inspiring conclusions in the history of sports. At the time, everyone believed that this was the last NBA game that he would ever participate in, and up until Kobe's farewell game in 2016, this exhibition contest stood alone as the most incredible farewell game by a Los Angeles Laker. Amazingly, over 3 decades later, Magic is still going, with the same smile and with the same enthusiasm that he was famous for. The 1986-87 Los Angeles Lakers. who many people consider as the strongest championship group of the Showtime Lakers era. The Lakers organization has an incredibly strong and rich history, with many greats represented by some of the greatest players of all time. Even with all those great teams considered, many people still recognize this 87 group as the greatest Laker team, or even the greatest basketball team of NBA history. No team greater represents the Lakers' brand, culture, and identity than the Showtime Lakers, whose fast-paced and exciting style of play helped define an entire era of NBA basketball. Leading this group at the point guard position was none other than the incredibly dynamic Earvin "Magic" Johnson. The 6'9" point guard had the first of his 3 MVP seasons, as he was the engine that drove the Lakers' high-octane offense. With his sudden and pinpoint decision-making, all of his teammates had to be ready at all times for the easier scoring opportunities that Magic would provide for them. It was another remarkably productive year for Magic, as he averaged about 24 points, a league-leading 12.2 assists, 6.3 rebounds, and over 1.5 steals on 52.2% shooting. Simply put, it was one of the greatest dual threat seasons the league has ever seen, as Magic wasn't just the NBA's leader in assists per game, but he was also top 10 in points per game, which is easily the highest anyone has ever ranked in scoring, while averaging at least 12 assists per game. His support in the backcourt was the underrated 6'3" shooting guard Byron Scott. Scott loved to be on the finishing end of Magic's fast break, and had a solid mid-range pull-up jumper. He didn't shoot a tremendous amount of threes, but when he did, he was one of the most efficient shooters in the entire league, as he hit 43.6% from that distance, which was the 4th best percentage in the entire league. His offensive impact should get more credit for his team's success, as he put up 17 points per game during the 86-87 regular season. Starting at small forward was the 6'9" star, big game James Worthy. James is one of the most overlooked greats of basketball history and was the perfect running mate for Magic Johnson. James loved to run the floor and score in transition, and was the most frequent beneficiary of Magic's no-look passes. That wasn't the only way he scored his points though. James was great with his back to the basket and in face-up situations with the opponent, as he had one of the quickest first steps the game has ever seen. His unique ability to find his way to the paint led him to have an elite field goal efficiency, especially at his position, as he shot 53.9% on the season. He was selected to be an All-Star for the 2nd straight season, and on the year, he averaged nearly 20 points and 6 rebounds. Starting at power forward was the young AC Green, who always played with hustle and heart, and who was a couple rebounds short of a double-double average in only 28 minutes per game. AC certainly wasn't one of the major stars on the Lakers roster, but his contribution shouldn't be downplayed, as he was solid defensively in the interior, and he was very reliable at securing the boards. He's also the most dependable player of all time when it comes to availability, as AC is easily the all-time record holder for consecutive games played, and only missed 3 games throughout the entirety of his career. Then of course, starting at center was the captain, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. At 39 years old, Kareem certainly wasn't anywhere near his prime anymore, but his age didn't stop him from being one of the better centers of the NBA, as he poured in his 17.5 points per game and 6.7 rebounds on his typical, incredibly efficient field goal percentage. Despite his age, Kareem was still very capable of finishing in the fast break, but the majority of his production came in half-court sets with his iconic skyhook shot, which, coming from the 7'2" Kareem, is probably the most indefensible shot the game has ever seen. Accompanied with their all-time great starting 5 was a powerful bench, especially concerning the first 3 players of the second unit. First off is Michael Cooper. Cooper is probably the greatest perimeter defender that no one talks about. He was incredibly tenacious with his on-ball defense, and was usually the player who was assigned to contain the opponent's best perimeter score. For his career, Cooper made an astonishing 8 all-defense teams, and his 1987 campaign was even better, as he was that season's Defensive Player of the Year. He was one of the original 3-and-D type of players, as he shot 38.5% from three-point range on 2.8 three-point attempts per game, which, believe it or not, was actually a lot of attempts in the 80s, and he attempted the second most three-point shots that season among all NBA players. Midway through the season, the Lakers acquired Michael Thompson in a trade. He was a 6'10" center/power forward who was a finesse type of player. He was a solid scoring threat in his days before Los Angeles, averaging as many as 20 points per game. But with this all-time great Lakers squad, he would simply need to be a spark off the bench, and that's exactly what the 32-year-old did, as he chipped in with over 11 points and 5 rebounds on only 23 minutes per game.
Also in the heart of the rotation was the 6'8" Kurt Rambis, who didn't have a pretty style of play, but he was another one of those players who did the little things well. He would fight for loose balls, help defend the Celtics bigs, and was always a sure thing to give 100% effort. This powerful roster of incredible individual players was a team that seemed tailor-made for Magic Johnson's skill set, as every member of the roster, including Kareem, was excellent at running the floor and pushing the tempo. I know I've alluded to this several times so far in this video, but I can't emphasize enough how uniquely fast this group was, as they treated every gained possession like it was the start of a track meet. Sometimes it almost seemed like they were completely forcing a fast break tempo, but even then, they still found ways to make it work. If they had to slow things down, they could, as Magic sometimes orchestrated the offense like a quarterback from the top of the key, and there's not many players who are better scoring options in the post than Kareem and James Worthy. Under Pat Riley's strong leadership and insatiable desire to win, this Lakers team had the league's best 65-17 record throughout the regular season. In the playoffs, no one was a challenge for them throughout the Western Conference, as they swept the Denver Nuggets in 3 games, defeated the Golden State Warriors in 5 games, and then swept the Seattle Supersonics out of the Western Conference Finals. Waiting for them in the NBA Finals was their rival and true challengers, the Boston Celtics. This was simply Los Angeles' time though, as they controlled the pace of the series and imposed their will upon Boston, defeating them in 6 games. To go along with Magic's iconic game-winning baby skyhook in Game 4, he also put up an incredibly monstrous stat line, nearly achieving the first triple-double average in NBA Finals history. It was a series performance that was so impressive that by the end of it, even Larry Bird was conceding that Magic Johnson had become the best player in the NBA. Looking at the results of this group over the 1987 season, we see that the Lakers finished with a league-best 65-17 record. They statistically had the league's best offense and the 7th best defense overall that season. They beat teams by a strong average of 9.3 points over the course of the season, and they coasted through the playoffs with a 15-3 record, represented by that season's MVP and Finals MVP, Magic Johnson. There's many GOAT-worthy teams of NBA history, but in a 7-game playoff series, this team may very well be the best of the best. As far as how they would match up against the other all-time great teams, well, I think the key would be for them to control the game's tempo, and if they were able to do that, then there's a decent chance that no one would beat them in a 7-game series, as a high-scoring and free-flowing style plays too much into the hands of this team. The key would be to get them to play in a physical half-court game, which is something the 96 Bulls or 89 Pistons may have been able to do successfully in a hypothetical matchup. So what do you think? Is the 87 Lakers the greatest team of all time? Are they even the greatest Laker team of all time? Let me know in the comment section below. He's known as the captain, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. For many years, he was the NBA's all-time leading scorer, and before Michael Jordan won his 6 championships, most people considered Kareem as the greatest player in basketball history. To this day, some still do. Heading into the 1988-89 NBA season, Kareem was 41 years old. He was a 6-time league MVP, a 6-time NBA champion, and a 2-time Finals MVP. Alongside of Magic Johnson and James Worthy, Kareem and the Lakers were looking for their 3rd straight title. It was an extra emotional time in Los Angeles though, because Kareem had announced that this would be his last season in the NBA long before the regular season had concluded. With this in mind, the Lakers were motivated to win the championship yet again for their star center, sending him out on a high note and delivering a storybook ending. But now we fast forward in time. In June of 1989, the NBA Finals were about to take place between the Los Angeles Lakers and the Detroit Pistons. At first glance, it seemed like a colossal battle between 2 dynastic teams, but to understand the shocking results of this series, context is needed. The Detroit Pistons were a strong team who had finished the regular season with a 63-19 record. The team was rich in talent with veterans like Isaiah Thomas, Joe Dumars, Bill Laimbeer, Mark Aguirre, Dennis Rodman, and Vinnie Johnson. They had an all-time great defense and one of the deepest rosters the NBA had ever seen. All of this team was incredibly talented and appeared on paper as if they were championship ready, but the Pistons were yet to prove it in the postseason, and many were skeptical about their abilities to dethrone the defending champions. Just 1 year earlier, the same two teams met in the 1988 NBA Finals, and after a long, hard-fought 7-game series, the Lakers had come out on top, like they had many times throughout the 1980s. The Los Angeles Lakers were heading into the '89 Finals as the defending back-to-back NBA champions, who were seeking the NBA's first three-peat since the 1960s. All of the momentum was clearly on the Lakers' side. The 1987 and 1988 Los Angeles Lakers are still recognized even to this day among the greatest teams in NBA history. The Lakers had begun the decade with a championship and were looking to finish off the decade with their third straight championship and sixth championship in the 80s. They seemed poised to do it too. Magic Johnson was arguably the NBA's best player at the time and led the Lakers to have the best offense in the NBA that season, while securing the League MVP award. He was accompanied by his usual Hall of Fame supporting cast, like James Worthy, who was in the prime of his career and was coming off of last year's Finals MVP award. And of course, he also had Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, that would be retiring at the end of the season. So the still productive captain of the Los Angeles Lakers was anticipating a fairy tale ending for his career, securing a legendary 7th NBA championship ring as he rode off into the sunset. The story of the season appeared to be indicating that destiny was in fact on the Lakers' side. Not only was the narrative supporting the Lakers, but so was the eye test. The Lakers were an absolute juggernaut throughout the 1989 Western Conference playoffs. The Lakers began the first round of the playoffs by sweeping the talented Portland Trail Blazers 3-0. The second round, they swept an even better Sonics team 4-0. And then they destroyed the powerful 55-win Phoenix Suns in the conference finals 4-0. The Lakers were undefeated throughout the Western Conference playoffs. They were heading into the NBA Finals against the Detroit Pistons, looking to make history and become the only team ever to go undefeated in the NBA playoffs. As a quick recap, the Lakers were going for their third straight title against the team they had just beat the previous year, looking for the exclamation point of a sixth championship in a decade that they had already claimed as their own, led by the league MVP on the final year of arguably the greatest player of all time, with a chance to declare themselves as the greatest team of all time by finishing out an undefeated postseason run, which had never been done before in the history of the NBA. Both of these finals teams were incredibly talented and championship worthy, so a sweep wasn't necessarily expected, but it was presumed that if a sweep was going to happen, it was going to be the Lakers who were doing the sweeping. But as we like to say in the sports world, that's why they play the game. As a footnote, the Los Angeles Lakers shooting guard Byron Scott would be missing the series for his team after popping his hamstring in practice the day before the finals began. With that being said, Michael Cooper was replacing him in the starting lineup. Cooper was a former Defensive Player of the Year and a quality three-point shooter in the NBA during his era, so the Lakers still appeared to be in great shape. When the games began, the Pistons got off to a hot start and never relinquished it. The absence of Byron Scott was beginning to be felt in this series. With Scott unavailable, the Lakers' rotation suffered and defending all of the Detroit Pistons' perimeter scoring guards became even more difficult. The Pistons took the first game 109-97, leaving the Lakers' hopes of an undefeated postseason run in shambles. The Lakers were poised to bounce back in Game 2. Despite Joe Dumars taking advantage of the Lakers being shorthanded on guards and dropping 24 points in the first half alone, the Lakers still managed to have a 62-56 lead at halftime. If the Lakers could hold on, they would be tying the series at a game apiece, while taking home court advantage with the series heading back to Los Angeles. But that's when disaster struck. With only several minutes left in the third quarter, the Lakers were up by a bucket, and Detroit was on a fast break when Magic Johnson started hobbling. He had pulled his hamstring, and the pain was clearly seen on his face. Magic wanted to push through it, but eventually he had no choice but to sit out the rest of the game. With their MVP gone, the Lakers fought valiantly, but ultimately came up short, falling to the Pistons 108-105. With Game 3 being played back in Los Angeles, the Lakers found themselves in a must-win situation. With the season on the line, Magic Johnson started Game 3, but he wouldn't last very long. After just 5 minutes of play, Magic left the game with severe pain in his hamstring. The still talented Lakers stepped up to the challenge and tried to win at home without their best player. But despite James Worthy's 26 points and Kareem's vintage effort of 24 points and 13 rebounds, the Pistons' healthy talent still prevailed in a close one, 114 to 110. At this point, the writing was on the wall for the Lakers. Magic Johnson didn't even try to play in the 4th game of the NBA Finals. James Worthy was one superstar who wasn't going out without a fight, and dropped an efficient 40 points in Game 4. Despite the Lakers' good start to the game, the Pistons' overall healthy talent eventually wore them down, winning the 4th and final game of the series, completing what is now known as one of the most stunning sweeps in NBA history. Kareem closed out his final game at the age of 42, while his iconic co-star was forced to watch from the sidelines. In that last performance, Kareem finished with just 7 points, 3 rebounds, and 3 assists on 2 of 8 shooting. Ultimately, it's not the worst way for a legend to end his career, but considering how things deteriorated in the NBA Finals and how the Lakers won the championship just a year prior, Kareem went down as another example of a player calling it quits just a little later than what would have been ideal. So what do you guys think? What is the most brutal ending to an NBA star's career? I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comment section below. Magic was a savant with a basketball, as he's arguably the greatest passer that the game of basketball has ever seen. This was his bread and butter, and he's famous for being the successful, flashy leader of the Lakers' Showtime offense. There's no question that Magic's natural preference was being a distributor. But with that being said, Magic could have been a leading scorer whenever it was necessary. He was very reliable with his back to the basket, as he used his size over the smaller guards to be a fantastic post scorer. He also had a very dependable baby hook shot, which he used frequently throughout his career. Magic had 6 games in his career where he scored at least 40 points, and specifically in the 1987 NBA Finals, he led all players in points, outscoring even the legendary Larry Bird and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, as he averaged 26.2 points over the series while still getting 13 assists per game. The 89-90 season was the first year after Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's retirement, and because of this, Magic had to take on a heavier load as a scorer, and he did that extremely well. In the 1990 postseason, Magic averaged 25.2 points per game, which was the 3rd highest scoring average of all players in those playoffs, trailing only Michael Jordan and Patrick Ewing. If he wasn't so unselfish as a giver, he likely would have been one of the best scorers from the 80s.
So there's been many different eras in basketball history, and in specifically the 80s, that decade is known for a few major aspects. Magic Johnson and Larry Bird's rivalry, the beginning of Michael Jordan's career, and of course, the Bad Boy Pistons. But outside of that, there's still many talented teams and players who don't get the attention they deserve. Today, upon viewer request, I'm diving into the Western Conference in the 1980s as we evaluate how good and how deep that conference was at this period. We're starting off with the most obvious team, the Los Angeles Lakers. They were a legitimate super team led by their trio of Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and James Worthy. We already know a ton about the first two. Magic Johnson was the greatest point guard of basketball history, who led the Lakers' fast-paced and high-octane offense to earn the nickname Showtime. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, known as the captain, was still an elite center in the league, although he was past his prime days of the 1970s. Still, he fit in beautifully as a big man in Magic's fast break. And when the Lakers chose to slow it down, there was no better way to get a sure bucket than dropping it into the post where Kareem could use his indefensible skyhook shot. The guy who's the most underrated one in this mix is big game James Worthy, whose nickname was very fitting considering the fact that he was one of the most clutch performers the game has ever seen. He averaged around 20 points per game during his prime, and the 6'9" small forward had one of the quickest first steps the game has ever seen. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. James Worthy deserves his own statue outside of Staples Center. Without him, the Lakers certainly don't win the 1998 NBA championship over the Pistons in 7 games. In that 7th and deciding game, James dropped 36, 16, and 10 on 68% shooting and was named the Finals MVP of that series. Along with that all-time great trio, they also had a significant amount of depth, including their 6'5" shooting guard, Michael Cooper, who was a part of all 5 of their championship runs that decade. Cooper was one of the original 3-and-D type of players, and he's one of the great defensive players that most young viewers have never heard of. He made 8 straight all-defense teams that decade and was the 1987 Defensive Player of the Year. They also had a quality transition scorer in Byron Scott, and they also had a 6th Man of the Year candidate, Michael Thompson, in the second half of the decade. Considering how overpowered this juggernaut was, it's no wonder they represented the West in the NBA Finals 8 out of 10 seasons. The second team we're looking at is the Houston Rockets. They were not great in the first half of the decade, but after acquiring Hakeem Olajuwon in the 1984 draft, that all would quickly change. The Twin Tower combination of Ralph Sampson and Hakeem Olajuwon quickly made them prominent contenders in the West. They also had key scoring sparks like Lewis Lloyd and Robert Reed. They made it as far as the NBA Finals in 1986, and after they had defeated the favored Lakers in the West Finals, the hype around this team was immense. With Hakeem at the age of 23 and Sampson at the age of 25, it seemed as if it was only a matter of time before the league was theirs. Unfortunately, their success was short-lived, and so was the career of Sampson, as he began dealing with significant back and knee problems that had him out of the league by the time he was barely into his 30s. The next team is one of the less talked about and fascinating gems of the 1980s, and that's the Denver Nuggets. They were led by 2 solid and relatively unknown stars, Alex English and Fat Lever. Of all the players in the entirety of the 1980s, no one scored more total points than Alex English, who averaged as high as 29.8 points per game in 1986. He was an incredibly efficient 6'7" small forward who had a lethal mid-range jump shot with an extremely high release point that was rarely blocked, which led him to make 8 straight All-Star teams in that era. His co-star was the 6'3" point guard / shooting guard Lafayette Lever, known as Fat Lever for short. Lever was a pretty good distributor and a reliable scorer who was very close to 20 points per game during his prime. With this duo leading the way, Denver had an extremely fast and potent offense. In 6 out of the 10 seasons that decade, Denver led all teams in points scored. They were a contender, and they had a potential championship team if it wasn't for one major problem. They were terrible defensively, and when I say terrible, I mean excruciatingly awful. The concept was basically that the best defense was more offense. Every season that decade, they finished as a bottom 5 team in points allowed, including 4 straight seasons where they were the worst in the entire league. Despite all of their defensive woes, this team still made it to the conference semifinals 4 times, and they made it to the Western Conference Finals in 1985, where they lost in 5 games to the eventual champion Los Angeles Lakers. Then there was the Utah Jazz, who were among the worst teams in the league for the first half of the decade. But around the mid-80s is when they added Karl Malone and John Stockton, and their fortunes began to shift. Malone and Stockton are most famously known for their 2 trips to the NBA Finals in 1997 and 1998, but their best seasons statistically actually came in the late 80s. Nobody really reflects on the 80s Jazz as a Big 3 team, but you could, considering the underrated big man they had down low, the 7'4" monster, Mark Eaton. Despite not being very well known, Mark was one of the greatest defensive players to ever live. To say that it was difficult to score over Mark in the paint would be a massive understatement, as he made 5 all-defense teams, was the Defensive Player of the Year twice, and he led the league in blocks 4 times, including the 1985 season where he averaged 5.6 blocks per game. Officially, that's the highest blocks per game average for a season in NBA history. They also had one of the forgotten great leapers of years past, the 6'4" shooting guard Daryl Griffith. Daryl could score and he had a reliable jump shot, but what he was known for more than anything was his incredible dunks, which earned him the nickname Dr. Dunkenstein. He wasn't a great defensive player, but he scored over 20 points a game for his first 5 seasons. Unfortunately, injuries shortened his career, and he began having those injuries right around the time that Malone and Stockton joined the team, so their prime didn't quite overlap, as he was only a 10 to 15 points per game scorer by the time that Malone and Stockton broke out as superstars. Despite being rich in talent, they still were not able to get past Magic Johnson's super team, getting as far as Game 7 of the 1988 West Semifinals, where the eventual champion Lakers closed it out. Another team who was making deep runs in the West playoffs was the well-balanced Dallas Mavericks. Their leading star was the elite scorer, Mark Aguirre, who spent his prime 8 seasons with the Dallas Mavericks before he eventually won 2 championships with the Bad Boy Pistons. He put up strong numbers in his years as a Maverick, averaging as high as 29.5 points per game in 1984. His co-star was the reliable and consistently good scorer, Rolando Blackman. The 6'6 guard was another one of those great mid-range shooters of the 80s, and his prime years saw about 20 points per game on over 50% shooting. Some great role players got their start there as well, like one of the original stretch 4 shooters, the 6'9 Sam Perkins, and a future 6 Man of the Year, the 6'10 Detlef Schrempf. At their best 3-year stretch with their many weapons, this unit was seen as a legitimate threat to the Lakers. And in 1988, they made it to the Western Conference Finals, where they pushed Magic, Kareem, and Worthy's Lakers to 7 games before Los Angeles closed it out. The last one to highlight is more so a player than an entire team, and that's the 6'10 power forward Tom Chambers. He was a 4-time All-Star and one of the premier scorers of that decade. His greatest performance was a 60-point explosion in a revenge game against his former team. He was an incredible athlete who could play above the rim and has one of the most ridiculous-looking dunks of all time. He spent most of his years in the 80s with the Seattle Supersonics, but it wasn't until he joined the Phoenix Suns that he got his first taste of competing. In 1989, Chambers and Kevin Johnson led the Suns to a 55-27 record, while Chambers was averaging over 25 points per game. They then cruised to the Western Conference Finals before they were swept by the defending champion Lakers. These were pretty much all of the competing teams in the Western Conference during the 80s. Although I do think there was some pretty solid teams, and you could certainly argue that the West 80s was underrated, they certainly weren't as strong as the fiercely competitive Eastern Conference. In the 1980s, there were 25 50-win teams in the Western Conference. In the 80s for the Eastern Conference, there was 35 50-win teams, which pretty much sums up the balance of power during that decade. And that's certainly interesting because it's arguably the last decade we've seen where the East was stronger than the West. The West in the 80s certainly wasn't one of the greatest conferences we've ever seen, but due to the rich Eastern Conference in that decade, and due to the overpowered Lakers representing the West in the NBA Finals 8 out of 10 years, there have unfortunately been some nice teams and quality players who become lost and overlooked in the game's history. Hopefully this video helped shine a spotlight on some of them.
The world is a much different place than it was 10 years ago, as there is more constant information at our fingertips than ever before. Any single play, action, or moment can go absolutely viral in an instant. Within a matter of minutes, the entire sports world can be made aware of a significant event, and before you know it, everyone is chiming in with their thoughts and emotions. But NBA basketball hasn't always been this way. Many things have happened in years past that were jaw-dropping developments, and if those same developments were to take place in today's world, they would absolutely break the internet. One of the most shocking and insane events of basketball history took place nearly 4 decades ago. On November 9th, 1984, the two favorites in the Eastern Conference were meeting up for their first matchup of the regular season, the defending champion Boston Celtics and the previous champions, the Philadelphia 76ers. At this point in history, Boston and Philadelphia had one of the fiercest ongoing rivalries, as the 76ers represented the old guard with their battle-tested veterans, and the Celtics were the youthful rising power in the conference. Every time these teams met up, an epic battle was expected, not just because of the immense talent on both sides, but also because of the intense physical nature of both teams, and neither side was willing to back down. Just recently before this game was a preseason game. The Celtics' Cedric Maxwell and Phillies' Moses Malone got into a violent fight, which was soon followed up with another intense fight between Larry Bird and Mark Ivoroni, which resulted in ejections. Again, this was the intensity of the two teams meeting in a preseason game. Now this upcoming game on November 9th was nationally televised, and was one of the more highly anticipated regular season games of NBA history. Not just for the rivalry, the star power, and the fact that they had won the previous 2 championships, but it was also for the fact that both of these teams were undefeated. The two faces of the Eastern Conference, Larry Bird and Julius Erving, found themselves in a heated individual battle. Anytime two superstars clash on the basketball court is sure to garner attention, but it's something else entirely for those two stars to get into an actual heated fight. Now up to this point, both of these superstars actually got along pretty well as friends, and highly respected one another's abilities. You wouldn't know it though, based on how things unfolded on the court. The game was now underway, and to the surprise of absolutely no one, the physical intensity was extremely high. Now at this time in NBA history, only 2 referees were assigned to work each game. Famous referee Dick Bavetta was one of them for this game, but he was a relatively new NBA referee at this point, so because of this, he was assigned to ref the game with a more experienced veteran official, Jack Madden. Early into the second half, the Boston Celtics guard Dennis Johnson dove after a loose ball and accidentally slid into Jack Madden's legs. This collision broke the veteran official's leg on impact, and as a result, he had to be carried out of the game on a stretcher. And now, the less experienced Dick Bavetta was left to officiate the game by himself. There were absolutely no reserve referees waiting in the wings. In an attempt to gain control of a chaotic basketball game, Bavetta pulled both of the team's head coaches into a huddle and asked them to keep themselves and their team on their best behavior, since he was all alone to ref the game. Both coaches agreed, but only with their words and not with their actions, as Bavetta had to give out numerous technical fouls after the huddle. Only a couple minutes into the second half, Bavetta ejected Philadelphia's head coach Billy Cunningham after he gave him what he thought was his second technical foul. The thing is, Jack Madden had given Philly's head coach a technical foul in the first half, but then decided to rescind the tech and gave it to a Philadelphia player instead, which means Dick Bavetta wrongly ejected a coach with only 1 technical foul. After a couple minutes, Bavetta learned of this error and had to send a staff member to get Cunningham out of the locker room so he could continue to coach the game. To put it simply, this game was already a messy circus, and emotions were obviously extremely high. But no one knew just how much worse things were about to get. It was a close game halfway into the third, but on an individual level, Larry Bird was destroying Julius Erving on both ends of the court. With 6 minutes left in the third quarter, Larry had a whopping 42 points on 74% shooting, compared to Erving, who only had 6 points on a terrible 23% shooting. And of course, you guys know Larry Bird. He was letting Erving hear about it every step of the way, trash-talking him as he buried jumper after jumper. At the rate Bird was going, a 70-point night was looking like a very realistic outcome, all while Erving was experiencing one of the worst performances of his entire career. Understandably, this whole process was incredibly frustrating to Erving. So when the 2 stars were battling for position down the court, Erving got right up against his body when Bird swung his elbow towards Erving in what appeared to be an attempt to clear some space. Larry was whistled for an offensive foul for the elbow, and he was irate at the call and started letting the referee hear about it. According to Julius Erving, he extended his arm towards Bird in an attempt to restrain him from the referee. Larry didn't like that very much, and before you know it, a gesture that was made in an attempt to keep the peace turned into both players literally choking each other. After the 2 stars had each other by the throat, Larry then took the first swing at Erving, and it was on. Moses Malone and Charles Barkley of the 76ers grabbed a hold of Bird from behind and held him in place with a headlock as Erving repeatedly punched the trapped Bird in the face. By the time the chaos had finally been put to a halt, both players had been ejected out of the game. Eventually, each star was fined $7,500 apiece for their part in the brawl. The Celtics went on to win the game 130 to 119 and remained undefeated. If you feel like the NBA is the same today as it was in the 80s, all you need to know in order to change your mind is that neither of these players were suspended for this vicious altercation, and Erving went as far as continuously punching a defenseless player in the face, and yet neither of them missed a game. Bird was even playing against the Washington Bullets the very next day on the second game of a back-to-back. Now take a moment to imagine something like this happening in the modern NBA. The last 2 championship teams meeting in the biggest game of the year, both teams being undefeated, and 2 of the biggest stars in the league get into an incredibly gruesome fight. It would kind of be like Giannis and LeBron getting into a brutal fight, and naturally, social media would be exploding at the event. Imagine if LeBron was consistently punching a defenseless Giannis in the face, while Anthony Davis held Giannis in place. And then on top of that, LeBron doesn't even get suspended. Obviously, this analogy doesn't totally work, as they weren't the last two champions, and they were never close to having an undefeated matchup this season. Even by the most crazy hypothetical modern comparison, it still doesn't match up to the gravity of that fight in 1984. In some ways, it really was like the Wild West in the 1980s. Now here's the thing, these two legends had to meet up again in the regular season just 1 month later. This time, on December 12, 1984, the rematch took place in the 76ers home building in Philadelphia. Obviously, everyone watching was waiting to see if there was yet another fight in store for Larry Legend and Dr. J. For the most part, everything was pretty cordial between the stars. But if Irving was hoping that this would be his revenge game where he would get the upper hand on Bird, then he was left awfully disappointed. Once again, Larry methodically picked Julius apart as he once again dominated the matchup, dropping 34 points, 9 rebounds, and 5 assists on 57% shooting, compared to Irving, who only dropped 16 points on 39% shooting from the field. At this point, Boston had firmly established their mental edge over the 76ers, and when these two contenders later met up in the Eastern Conference Finals, Bird once again had the upper hand, as the Celtics comfortably eliminated the 76ers in just 5 games. Although Irving might have dealt the most punishment to Bird when they physically fought, Bird never stopped abusing Irving that season in terms of the actual basketball. First off, Larry Bird, who ruined the legacy of Sidney Moncrief. All of you know who Larry Bird is. He was a 3-time NBA champion, a 3-time MVP, an all-around skillful threat everywhere on the court, and simply one of the top 10 greatest basketball players of all time. Let's be real, this 6'9" assassin doesn't need much more of an introduction. On the other hand, there's Sidney Moncrief. This 6'4" guard was one of the great two-way players of NBA history, as he was actually the first Defensive Player of the Year in 1983, and he's the only guard who's ever won the award multiple times. At his peak, he was averaging more than 22 points per game, and he was a perennial All-Star, earning a selection in 5 straight seasons. He was the leader of the Milwaukee Bucks franchise throughout the majority of the 1980s, as they were talented enough to be considered as frequent title contenders. Unfortunately for Moncrief, he was playing on an Eastern Conference contender at the same time that a prime Larry Bird was, and more often than not, when their paths crossed, Bird showed no mercy whatsoever. Things started off looking bright for the Bucks though. The two teams met up in the 1983 Eastern Conference semifinals, and the Bucks brought their best effort, as Moncrief put up these strong averages over the course of the series. On the other hand, Larry was hindered by an intense case of the flu that actually caused him to miss Game 2. At the end of the day, the second-seeded Bucks stunningly swept the third-seeded Boston Celtics, and Larry Bird said it was a massive embarrassment that he would never forget for the rest of his life. Well, it would seem that Bird took that moment personally, because he would never let Moncrief and the Bucks ever defeat him again. In the following season, both teams appeared to be even stronger, as the first-seeded Celtics met with the second-seeded Bucks in the 1984 Eastern Conference Finals. The series wasn't nearly as competitive as many expected it to be, as Bird was on an absolute mission, and over the course of the series, he dropped these monstrous averages, leading the Celtics' entire team in points, rebounds, assists, and steals, on remarkable efficiency. The Celtics comfortably eliminated the Bucks in 5 games, and obviously, this prevented Moncrief from making his first trip to the NBA Finals. 2 years later, the teams met up again in the 1986 Eastern Conference Finals. Bird had a series for the ages, as he nearly averaged a triple-double on absolutely goofy efficiency splits. Milwaukee never stood a chance, as Larry and the Celtics swept them in just 4 games, with an average margin of victory of 15 points. This was now the second straight season that Bird kept Moncrief from reaching the NBA Finals. The following year, the two teams met in the playoffs for the 4th time in just 5 seasons, and it was in the 1987 Eastern Conference semifinals. With the recent acquisitions of Jack Sikma and John Lucas, Milwaukee was poised to put up a greater fight than the previous season, and they did just that. Facing elimination in Game 6, Sidney Moncrief produced an epic performance as he dropped 34 points, 6 rebounds, 4 assists, and 3 steals on 55% shooting. They pushed Bird and the Celtics to a 7th game in Boston, but at the end of the day, Larry Legend was once again too much, as he put up 30, 10, and 8 in the decisive game, and the Celtics took home the win with a final score of 119 to 113. Yet again, Bird had a dominant series, filling up the stat sheet across the board. In my opinion, Moncrief is already regarded as one of the most underrated players in basketball history. But because of Bird, he was denied several trips to the NBA Finals, and he may have even gone on to win an NBA championship, which would have certainly made him a legendary figure in the city of Milwaukee. To this day, many young basketball fans have never even heard of Sidney Moncrief, but I promise you that wouldn't be the case if Larry Bird never existed. It is widely accepted that Larry Bird is one of the greatest NBA players of all time, and even sneaks his way into the GOAT debate among many basketball circles. The thing is, I personally rank Larry Bird higher than most people do, as he's currently sitting in the 6th spot on my all-time list, and I even have him ranked slightly ahead of Magic Johnson, which is certainly a more uncommon opinion. I think there's some major misconceptions to Bird's game that result in him not getting quite as much credit as I believe he deserves, and by the end of this video, I think that I can convince some of you that Larry Legend is in fact underrated. Before we get into some misconceptions, let's start with what most people already know about Bird, and I'll elaborate upon it. Over his 13-year career, Larry averaged 24.3 points on a stellar 56.4 true shooting percentage. Despite their talent-heavy history, Bird is the Celtics' all-time leading playoff scorer, so whether it was in the regular season or the postseason, he was always an efficient and lethal threat. He was obviously a legendary scorer and an incredibly efficient shooter. Larry is objectively one of the greatest three-point shooters of all time, as he's tied with Craig Hodges for the most three-point contests won in a career with a total of 3. The thing is, Hodges participated in a total of 8 three-point competitions, while Bird only participated in a total of 4. So he literally did the same amount of damage as the other all-time leader in half the amount of time. On top of all of this, you really could make the argument that Bird is the most all-around efficient scorer of NBA history. If that seems like a stretch, then consider this. During some of his prime years, Larry went on a 5-year stretch where he had 50-40-90 percentages. Only 9 players in NBA history have achieved at least one season of 50-40-90 percentages, yet Larry did it over a 5-year stretch while putting up just about 28, 10, and 7 each night. The only player who has come close to that all-around efficiency over such a long period of time is actually Steve Nash. But the thing is, Nash was never primarily a scorer and averaged roughly half the amount of points that Larry did during his stretch. To efficiently score that many points on that kind of volume of all-around shot attempts is something that no one else has ever done as well as Larry Bird did. Again, maybe some of you didn't know the extent of how lethal Larry was as an all-around efficient scorer, but I do feel like that's probably the most commonly understood aspect of his game. Now for the misconceptions and the details that definitely make Larry an underrated player. There are a lot of people, especially younger basketball fans, who believe that Larry was a subpar defender. This is incredibly inaccurate, as Bird wasn't just a good defensive player, but a great one. As a 6'9" small forward, he definitely had the size and length to frustrate the offensive opponent. Sure, there is the narrative that Larry was a slow and unathletic player, and thus it affected his defensive play. This is true to a certain extent, but it's also grossly exaggerated. What Larry did have are the most important traits of a great defensive player, which are hustle, heart, intelligence, effort, and availability. Larry was never lacking in any of these areas. He always put in the work, and he was incredible not only at reading the defenses, but also at anticipating them. Larry made 3 NBA All-Defense teams throughout the course of his career, and even finished as high as 3rd overall in the Defensive Player of the Year running in 1983. He wasn't just a solid on-ball and help defender, but he was also a terrific pickpocket, as Larry averaged a fantastic 1.7 steals per game over the course of his 13-year career. His best evening in this area came on February 18, 1985 against the Utah Jazz, when Larry dropped 30 points, 12 rebounds, 10 assists, and 9 steals in only 3 quarters of play. Due to them absolutely destroying the Jazz, Bird didn't play a second of the fourth quarter. To this day, the NBA record for the most steals in a single game is 11. So not only could he have easily been only the second player to ever achieve the quadruple-double, but if Bird had played the fourth, he might have been the record holder for the most steals in a game. You have to be a great defensive player in order to be in a position to seize that record. On top of all of that, Bird led the entire NBA in defensive win shares a total of 4 times. That's the 4th most in NBA history. The only players ahead of him on that list are Tim Duncan, George Mikan, and Bill Russell. That is a remarkably short list of great defensive players. I'm not trying to say that Bird was on the level of someone like Dennis Rodman or Scottie Pippen, but to call Larry anything other than a great defensive player is either completely ignorant or is just plain disrespect towards his game. The other key area where people underappreciate Bird was his rebounding ability, as Larry was simply one of the greatest rebounding small forwards that the game has ever seen. He was aggressive and tenacious as he got as high as 11 rebounds per game in 1983. Qualities that I mentioned earlier, like his size, hustle, and intelligence, are also things that helped him as he battled on the boards. Over the course of his career, Larry averaged a whopping 10 rebounds per game, and when he was starting specifically at the small forward position, he averaged 9.5 rebounds per game. That's the 3rd highest average among primary small forwards in NBA history. The only players ahead of him are Billy Cunningham and Elgin Baylor, who both played in the 1960s, which was easily the most inflated rebounding era of basketball history. So not only is Bird an underrated rebounder, not only is he objectively one of the all-time great rebounders, but he's also arguably the greatest rebounder ever at his position. Along with all the other skills I talked about, Larry was also a remarkably gifted facilitator. But I won't delve into that much, because like his shooting, I also think that's an area that a decent amount of people have a strong appreciation for. Ultimately, I think it's his solid defense and his elite rebounding that people underestimate, which is why I think he's underrated, regardless of the fact that people still refer to him as Larry Legend. I gotta be real with you guys. I have to monitor how much time I spend on social media platforms like Instagram and Twitter, because some of the basketball takes on there are seriously awful for my mental health. The amount of disrespect thrown around to various different generations of basketball is truly astonishing. One of the most common, disrespectful, and ignorant narratives that I constantly see being thrown around is that players in the 70s and 80s were basically just plumbers. Sometimes they'll even go as recent as calling dudes in the 90s plumbers. The idea is that guys like Magic Johnson and Michael Jordan took advantage of a bunch of unathletic, skinny-looking players. I hate this narrative because it's overly simplistic, and it doesn't accurately represent the league as a whole during those eras. So let me tell you what is true. Yes, generally speaking, players in the 80s, for example, didn't look as physically fit as players in today's NBA. This difference in appearance is mostly made up of muscle mass. Today, players' fitness routines are completely different from players in previous generations. Modern players have their own physical trainers. They have advanced fitness routines and training methods and better technology. Today, the average player is 6 foot 7 inches tall and weighs 216 pounds. 40 years ago, the average NBA player was also 6 foot 7 inches tall, but they weighed significantly less at only 205 pounds. I believe the majority of that 11-pound difference is made up of muscle mass. The thing is, although players didn't have as much muscle mass and definition, there were still players all over the league who had tremendous speed and roughly 40-inch vertical leaps. The problem with the differences in build is how people automatically equate this to a lack of athleticism. For example, Kevin Durant weighs about 8 pounds soaking wet, yet you would be crazy to say that he was unathletic. And despite being as skinny as he is, he's one of the greatest players of all time. Michael Jordan is another decent example. Although he put on tons of weight and muscle mass during the early 90s, arguably the best version we ever saw of Jordan was in 1988, when he was still extremely skinny, yet he won the MVP, the Defensive Player of the Year, and he put up the best all-around numbers of his career. This takes us to the modern player who is the focus of this video, Nikola Jokic. The Joker has been hit with this quote unathletic tag constantly throughout his career, as critical analysts and basketball fans continue to make this claim. Sure, he may not be the fastest runner or the greatest leaper, and he doesn't have almost any muscle definition, but he greatly makes up for it with his incredible court vision, with his size and wingspan, with his solid footwork, with his high basketball IQ, with his stamina, and with his efficient shooting all over the court. Jokic isn't close to being the greatest track and field athlete in the game today, but he is the best basketball player in the NBA today. The beauty of the game of basketball is that it's a form of art, and you don't have to be the most athletically gifted player to excel in the sport. You just have to be incredibly skilled and know how to play. If athleticism was the main separating factor between the average players and the great players, then a guy like Shannon Brown would have been dominating the NBA throughout the late 2000s. Some of you may not even know who Shannon Brown is, but if you were a Laker fan during that era, then you definitely do. That guy was providing a jaw-dropping highlight just about every other night. Although he had the speed, strength, and leaping ability to jump out of the gym, he simply lacked the skills of an elite basketball player, and before he reached the age of 30, he couldn't even find a spot on an NBA roster. I'll give another example, this time of an older player. Orlando Woolridge was a remarkable athlete, and honestly, a very quality basketball player. Much better than Shannon Brown, that's for sure. Orlando was a 6'9" small forward who was incredibly strong, with tremendous muscular definition. He was also quick and was one of the highest leapers in the entire league, regularly oohing and awing crowds with his insane displays of athleticism. Fun fact, he was also the first player to ever make an East Bay dunk in the NBA's dunk contest. With that being said, he didn't quite have the overall skills to be one of the best players in the league, as he never made a single NBA All-Star team, and a far less athletic guy like Larry Bird regularly cooked Woolridge almost every time they matched up against each other. Speaking of Larry Bird, I believe he's one of the legends who becomes the most validated by Nikola Jokic's success. Jokic is only 2 inches taller than Bird, but both guys had elite court vision. Both guys were elite rebounders, both guys were fantastic shooters, and both guys were fundamentally sound. Like Jokic, Bird certainly had the size to compete in any era. But from the day he was drafted into the league, Bird was constantly making a fool out of anyone who doubted his basketball abilities. He could handle the basketball, he could misdirect the opponent, he could hit a shot from seemingly anywhere on the court, and he facilitated as if he had eyes in the back of his head. Due to his timeless skills, if Larry Bird played in the league today, I believe he would dominate the Eastern Conference just like he dominated the East in the 1980s. If Nikola Jokic can do it, then so could Larry Bird. Nikola Jokic is a living, breathing example of stereotypical athleticism being extremely overrated in the minds of the basketball community. If I still haven't got my point across, then consider some of the recent events in NBA history. In 2016, a player who struggles to dunk a basketball became the first unanimous MVP in NBA history. In 2017, a player who was only 5 foot 9 inches tall averaged nearly 30 points per game. In 2018, Kevin Durant won his second straight Finals MVP award, and he was the guy at the draft combine who couldn't even do a single rep of the minimum weight bench press. And over the last 3 years, a player nearly won 3 straight MVPs while looking like he spends more time in his pantry than in the gym. Now let me be clear, my intentions are not to be disrespectful to today's modern players, but rather I'm leveling the playing field between today's players and generations past. No matter which NBA era you look at, you will find guys who were insanely gifted athletes, but just weren't great NBA players. And you'll also find guys who were not very gifted athletically, yet were some of the best players in the game. being extremely athletic, or at least appearing to be, doesn't automatically give you an advantage over the seemingly less athletically gifted players. This was true in 1963, it was true in 1993, and it's still true in 2023. I'll say it again, basketball is a form of art, and your knowledge, your discipline, and technique is way more crucial than your God-given athleticism. Listen, I don't throw this phrase around much, and I honestly think people probably call each other casuals way more often than is warranted. But if there's one opinion that makes someone look like a casual basketball fan more than anything else, it's when people are quick to belittle an entire generation of basketball players simply because they appear to be, quote, less athletic. Look no further than the man who's ruling the NBA today, building a legacy for himself while reaffirming the legacies of many greats before him.
Today, our matchup is the man known for his magic on the court, Earvin Johnson, versus Larry legend, Larry Bird. Both legends spent the entirety of their career with one of the most prestigious franchises of NBA history. Magic played 13 seasons with the Los Angeles Lakers, and Bird played 13 seasons with the Boston Celtics. Magic was a 6'9" point guard who weighed around 215 pounds. Larry was a 6'9" small forward/power forward who weighed around 220 pounds. Two men who were each accredited with saving the NBA in the 1980s. Two men who each have an argument of being the greatest player of their era. We'll compare these two greats with 5 major categories, which sometimes vary in categories depending on positions and playstyles. In this video for these two icons of basketball, the categories are scoring, facilitating, rebounding, defense, and accolades. First off, scoring. Magic Johnson was a much better scorer than people typically give him credit for, especially when you consider how he's one out of only 2 players to average over 10 assists per game for his career. Despite the fact that his number one priority was usually to get his teammates going, he still managed to consistently get his, as he averaged 19.5 points per game over the course of his career. He was a great finisher around the rim, and he managed to get himself more clean looks than most, since the defense always had to be on their heels because of his ability to find the open man. This led him to be extremely efficient throughout his career, as he shot 52% from the field over his 13 seasons, which is almost unheard of by point guard standards. He also was a tremendous free throw shooter, hitting 84.8% of his attempts over his career, and even led the league in overall free throw percentage in 1989. Now Bird, on the other hand, is immediately known for his scoring. He was also a 6'9" small forward with a high release point on his jumper, so contesting his shots was quite difficult. With his fantastic footwork, his underrated handles, his finesse around the basket, and lethal perimeter shooting, he averaged 24.3 points over the course of his career. He never led the league in scoring, but unlike Magic, he was right around the top of the list on several occasions. As far as perimeter scorers go, Bird has an argument for being the most efficient scorer in NBA history. He led the league in free throw percentage 4 times, and he also had 2 50-40-90 seasons in his career, which is the second most in NBA history. The only player with more 50-40-90 seasons was the Hall of Famer Steve Nash, but Nash was never close to being a near 30 points per game scorer like Larry was several seasons. So the fact that Bird was able to maintain that efficiency as a perimeter scorer and at such a high volume of shots is pretty much unprecedented. Magic gets some bonus points for being a capable and efficient scorer even while being an all-time leader in assists. But even with that being said, it's still not enough to close the gap between him and the all-around-the-court threat that is Larry Bird. Scoring goes to Larry Bird. Second up is facilitating. Now, I alluded to this in the previous topic, but Magic is arguably and probably considered by most as the greatest passer of all time. He has the highest assists per game average in NBA history at 11.2, and he led the league in assists 4 times. It's easy to simply look at the numbers and say that Magic was the best passer on his team, but he was so much more than just that. Magic was the engine that drove the Showtime Lakers' high-octane offense. Magic was obsessed with pushing the tempo nearly every time the Lakers gained possession, and it resulted in many easy buckets for his slashing teammates. His ability to make smart split-second decisions is unmatched, and his court vision would have you swearing that he has eyes in the back of his head with the passes he was consistently making. On top of all of that, he was a 6'9" point guard, so interfering with some of his higher passes was nearly impossible for many of his smaller defenders. Now Bird was a much better distributor than most people realize. He started his career as a power forward, and if he had remained in that position, then he would probably be known today as the greatest passing power forward of all time. He shared a similar ability to Magic in terms of their incredible court vision, and he's been praised by Magic on numerous occasions for that exact skill. He averaged 6.3 assists on his career, averaging as high as 7.6 in 1987. He was usually not among the assist leaders of the league, but he was consistently among the leaders at his position. The same way Magic got bonus points in the scoring category, Bird also gets bonus points in the facilitating category, as it was remarkable that Bird assisted his teammates as often as he did when you consider the fact that Bird chose to shoot the ball nearly 50% more often than Magic Johnson did. Still, unless you're a gold medalist in mental gymnastics, facilitating clearly has to go to Magic, as his incredible ability to make his teammates better is simply one of a kind. Third up is rebounding. Now this one can be a little bit tricky since I'm making the case for different positions. One is typically more of a perimeter player, while the other plays more in the interior, and naturally, the advantage goes to the interior player where most rebounds are available, especially in an era like the 80s where less perimeter shots are taken. All things considered, Magic was a pretty good rebounder, especially by point guard standards. He successfully used his superior height and frame to his advantage over smaller guards, and he was often hungry to get the ball as quickly as possible so he could then push the fast break on offense. He averaged 7.2 rebounds over the course of his career, getting as high as 9.6 in 1982. Now Larry Bird averaged 10 rebounds per game over his career, getting as high as 11 in 1983. One thing no one ever questioned about Bird back then was his hustle and heart. It was common for him to play the game with a physical and tenacious approach, and doing so continuously with 100% effort. These are qualities that naturally benefit a player's ability to secure the boards. This has resulted in Bird having the 50th highest rebounds per game average in NBA history. Most of the players on that list are either primarily power forwards or centers though, which Larry was not. He played mostly as a small forward. Among primary small forwards, Larry has the third greatest rebounds per game average in NBA history. When you consider the positions, this one is extremely close, but for me, the slight edge goes to Larry Bird. Not just because of his higher numbers, but it's about how he played to get those numbers, as Bird was known for a more grit and grind type approach, which is a great quality when you're banging for the boards in the 80s. Fourth on the list is defense. Magic was never considered as an elite defender, as he didn't make any all-defense teams in his career, but he was certainly a capable one. His sheer size made it somewhat difficult for opposing guards to score over him or to get into a favorable position with physicality. Magic had a high top speed that he always used on offense, but his lateral movement wasn't the quickest on defense, which made it sometimes difficult for him to stay in front of the quicker, smaller guards. His hands were decently quick, and he was pretty good at jumping the passing lanes, which resulted in him leading the league in steals twice, including the 1981 season where he averaged an incredibly strong 3.4 steals per game. He also averaged 1.9 steals over the course of his career, although he didn't have a strong vertical leap and was never a good shot blocker, as he only averaged 0.4 blocks over his career and never averaged at least one per game in a season, which is pretty surprising considering his height and length advantage over almost every opposing guard. Larry was known to be slow, and he wasn't the most quick or athletically gifted player, but I do think he's somewhat of an underrated defender compared to how he's perceived by the general public. The Boston Celtics were a consistently elite defensive team, and Bird's high basketball IQ was a significant help in that area. Bird made 3 all-defense teams and averaged 1.7 steals and 0.8 blocks over his 13 seasons. Bird could be a bit of a pest on defense, as his effort and tenacious attitude was never lacking. Due to his slower and less athletic frame, it wasn't uncommon for him to need help defensively if he was guarding some of the athletic and talented wings in the league, like Michael Jordan and Dominique Wilkins for example. With that being said, Bird was good at communicating with his teammates, trapping offensive players and forcing turnovers as a result. This one is somewhat close, but at the end of the day, Bird has the slightly better individual defensive numbers, he's the more accomplished defensive player, and he was the team leader of the consistently better defensive team throughout the decade. Defense goes to Larry Bird. Last on the list of categories is accolades, and both of these legends had a ton of them. Magic Johnson won 5 NBA championships, 3 Finals MVPs, and he won 3 League MVPs. He made 12 All-Star teams and 10 All-NBA teams. He was a 4-time assist champion and a 2-time steals champion. In his 13 seasons, he averaged 19.5 points, 7.2 rebounds, 11.2 assists, 1.9 steals, and 0.4 blocks on 61 true shooting percentage. Larry Bird won 3 NBA championships, 2 Finals MVPs, and 3 league MVPs. He made 12 All-Star teams, 10 All-NBA teams, and 3 All-Defense teams. He was also the 1980 Rookie of the Year and was a 2-time 50-40-90 player. In his 13 seasons, he averaged 24.3 points, 10 rebounds, 6.3 assists, 1.7 steals, and 0.8 blocks on 56.4 true shooting percentage. Based on this list, I think Magic has the slight advantage on accolades. Now, as far as how these players compare as a whole, as usual, it's extremely close. And the only reason I'm picking between these two is because I have to for the sake of the series. But for myself personally, Larry Bird is the more complete player and ranks higher on my all-time list. I think most of the time, people rank Magic slightly higher because of his edge in championships over Bird. But you have to also consider that basketball is a team sport, and although both legends were blessed with a tremendous supporting cast, also keep in mind that the East was definitely the stronger conference throughout the 80s, which meant it was even more difficult for the Celtics to get to the NBA Finals in the first place. Although I do think Bird is the slightly better and more complete individual player, I do think there is a strong argument for Magic. But I think that argument goes beyond the stat sheet, and leans more into the narrative that no one has ever made their teammates better than Magic Johnson did. Which is probably true, and if that's enough for him to be your choice, then I respect that. The 1985-86 Boston Celtics. They are universally recognized as one of the greatest teams of NBA history. Although the 80s were defined by super teams and rivalries, the 86 Celtics were never seriously threatened by any opposition that season. They steamrolled the league. Boston's starting five was one of the greatest ever on both ends of the court. The 6'4" Dennis Johnson started at point guard. Beside him was Danny Ainge at the 2-guard spot. Then you had Larry Bird at small forward, and Kevin McHale and Robert Parrish down low. Beyond their fantastic starting five was their depth. Leading the bench unit was the 6'11" Bill Walton, who was that year's 6th Man of the Year winner. Then you had guys like Scott Wedman, Jerry Seasting, Rick Carlisle, Sam Vincent, Greg Kite, and David Thirdkill. Looking at the results of this group, we see that the Celtics finished with a league-best 67-15 record. They had the 3rd best defense and the number 1 ranked offense that season. They beat teams by an average of 9.4 points over the course of the season. They dominated the playoffs with a 15-3 record, and they had that season's MVP, Larry Bird. Their head coach was Casey Jones, who often doesn't get enough attention for the success of his team. He took over the Celtics in 1983 and spent 5 years there. In these years, they went to the NBA Finals 4 out of those 5 seasons, and they won the championship twice. He had this team playing hard defense, and the chemistry was off the charts. Larry was basically their verbal player coach and leader. It's often said that groups take on the image of their leader, and in this case, it's very true. If I had to describe them in a word, I would call them unselfish. The ball movement of this team was incredibly beautiful to watch. Whether it was on the fast break or half-court sets, Boston was always looking to make the extra pass. Speaking of their leader, Larry Bird won his 3rd straight MVP that season with averages of 25.8 points, 9.8 rebounds, and 6.8 assists on 49.6% shooting. This was not among Bird's 50-40-90 seasons, but he was incredibly close. Something that people often forget is how Larry was also a very capable defender who made 3 all-defense teams in his career. Their consistent second scoring option Kevin McHale also had a monster season. He was almost always a sure thing whenever he was in the post and had his back to the basket. He had an incredibly high offensive IQ, some of the best footwork in the game, and amazing length with an incredibly high release point on his shot. When McHale was in the post, his teammates often called it the torture chamber due to the fact that he was so difficult to stop. That season, he averaged 21.3 points, 8.1 rebounds, and 2 blocks on 57.4% shooting. McHale was also first team all-defense that year. Speaking of defense, where they really stand out among the all-time great teams is their interior defense. Bird was 6'9", McHale was 6'10", and Parrish was 7'1". It wasn't just their height, but even more so, their length. We don't have a recorded wingspan for Parrish, but it looks like it was at least as long as his 7'1" height. McHale, on the other hand, had a freakish 8-foot-long wingspan. Assuming that estimate is completely accurate, That would give him the second longest wingspan in NBA history. Coming off the bench was another 6'11" big man, Bill Walton, who averaged 1.3 blocks and only 19 minutes played per game. Between Parrish, McHale, and Walton, you have solid rim protection for all 48 minutes of the game. This aspect was crucial to their success in the 1986 NBA Finals. The Houston Rockets were just coming off of beating Magic, Kareem, and Worthy's 62-win Lakers. Houston eliminated Los Angeles in only 5 games. With that being said, basketball is a game of matchups, and as good as the Twin Tower tandem of Ralph Sampson and Hakeem Olajuwon were, you're simply not going to beat the '86 Celtics with size, and Boston handled them in 6 games. One of the less talked about starters from the Celtics was Dennis Johnson. Dennis was the starting point guard, and over time, he's actually become one of the more underrated and overlooked players of NBA history. He was a former Finals MVP winner back when he won the championship as a member of the 1979 Seattle Supersonics. He was averaging 15.6 points this year with the Celtics, but he had got as high as 20 points per game during his career. Johnson's final All-Star appearance was just prior to the '86 season, and he received 5 All-Star selections in total. He was also the Celtics' best perimeter defender, who they relied heavily upon to slow down the great scoring guards in the league those years. He was second team All-Defense that season, and in total, DJ received 9 All-Defense team selections over the course of his career. He was also known to be a big game performer and had a smooth mid-range jump shot. You could say that their 6'4" shooting guard Danny Ainge was the worst player in their starting 5, but he was certainly far from a bad player. Danny averaged 10.7 points and 5.1 assists through the season, and he was actually very efficient in his contributions as he shot 50% from the field, 36% from three-point range, and 90% from the free throw line. Danny was also incredibly scrappy, he was a big trash talker, and one of the OG floppers of NBA history, which can easily be seen as a negative, but I can tell you as a Lakers fan who watched him play, there were plenty of times where Danny knew how to get under the offensive player's skin and would get the ref to make the crucial calls when they mattered most. It was super frustrating to me, but only because he was good at it. The Celtics were never seriously challenged in that postseason run. Despite a 49 and 63 point performance from Jordan, they swept the Bulls in the first round. After that, they easily handled Dominique and the Hawks in just 5 games. Then they swept Sidney, Moncrief, and the Bucks in the conference finals. As I mentioned earlier, the Rockets did push them to 6 games in the NBA Finals, but the Celtics got up to an early 3-1 lead, and the series was never really in doubt. What makes the '86 Celtics so dangerous is that they can attack you in so many ways offensively while being so versatile defensively. There isn't another team in NBA history that I could put against the Celtics in a 7-game series where I would feel like the Celtics wouldn't do well against them. On offense, they could run the fast break, but they could also slow it down and run things through the post. They could pick and roll you all day with their bigs. They could punish you from the outside with the all-time great shooting of Larry Bird, or they could simply run the isolation through McHale, which is always a good option. Boston natives know this already, but for the rest of you, it's important that you recognize the 1986 Celtics have a legitimate case for the title of greatest team of all time.
During his prime, Larry was known for filling up the stat sheet, but one game summed that up better than any other. In a blowout victory, Larry Legend put up a total of 30 points, 12 rebounds, 10 assists, and 9 steals on 59.1% shooting. The thing is, Larry didn't even play in the fourth quarter. Even crazier than that, he only played 33 minutes. Only 4 players in NBA history have ever achieved the illustrious quadruple-double, but none of those players did it in 3 quarters. At that point in history, only 1 player had achieved the quadruple-double. Not only could he have easily been only the second player to do it if he had simply played in the fourth quarter, but he had also tied the NBA record for the most steals in a game with 9. Just 1 more steal would have secured the record as his own, but Larry truly only cared about winning, so he passed that up too.
It was the night of December 12, 2002 in Oklahoma City. A man by the name of Eric Torpy and his 2 buddies drive past a Little Caesars pizza restaurant. It's at this moment that Eric and his buddies decide that it would be a good idea to rob the employee in the store. Eric's buddy shoots a couple employees and Eric ditches the scene, but unfortunately for Eric, he dropped his hat. Police find the hat, and a few months later, Eric's DNA is traced back to him, and he ends up in prison, sentenced to 30 years. Eric was a loyal Celtics fan and a Larry Bird fan, and Bird wore the jersey number 33. So Eric did what any logical Celtics fan would do, and request the judge to extend his sentence to 33 years to honor his favorite player. The judge was feeling accommodating that day and granted Eric the extra 3 years. Eric has now been in prison for 15 years and now says that he regrets his decision. Unfortunately, when Larry was asked about Eric's commitment to his honor, Bird declined to comment.
Larry's debut game also came on October 12, 1979, and what was simply an incredible day in the NBA. It may seem hard to believe, but there was once a time where Larry had to earn his minutes, although it certainly didn't last very long, as he efficiently filled up the stat sheet in only 28 minutes, with 14 points, 10 rebounds, and 5 assists on 50% shooting. Unfortunately, there is very limited footage available of this game online, but what you need to know is that Larry was his usual Larry self, and his Celtics got the W over the Houston Rockets 114-106. Bird's farewell performance came on May 17, 1992, in Game 7 of the Eastern Conference Semifinals against the Cleveland Cavaliers. At this point, Bird's athletic body was deteriorating fast, as he was now 35 years old and had been dealing with severe back problems for roughly half a decade. Not only that, but Magic Johnson's HIV announcement and absence from the league took a major toll on Bird's sense of motivation, which resulted in Larry deciding to hang it up when he still believed he had some game left in the tank. Due to his chronic back issues, Larry missed roughly 4 of the games that series, but he did play in the deciding 7th game. Larry had a modest contribution, but an efficient one, as he dropped 12 points, 5 rebounds, and 4 assists on 6 of 9 shooting from the field. It wasn't nearly enough, as the talented Cavs closed out the series with a blowout, as the final score was 122-104. Hawks and Celtics in the 1988 Eastern Conference Semifinals. This is easily one of the greatest solo duels that the league has ever seen, as Dominique Wilkins of the Atlanta Hawks was extremely hot, while Larry Legend refused to be denied down the stretch. To this day, this game is famously referred to as the Duel. The human highlight film was basically unstoppable right from the opening tip-off, as he was efficiently hitting everything from the field, leading the offense for his team. Larry waited until the 4th quarter to really start heating up though, as both superstars continued to trade difficult baskets. Wilkins scored 16 points in the final quarter, but Bird proceeded to show his legendary clutch gene as well, as he scored 20 points in the 4th quarter alone on a remarkable 9 of 10 shooting from the field. The lead continued to go back and forth in the final minutes, and it all came down to one possession. Dominique had a chance to tie the game with a 3-point shot, but Danny Ainge wisely intentionally fouled Wilkins, forcing him to shoot 2 free throws instead. Wilkins made the first and then proceeded to miss the second on purpose, but the Hawks couldn't recover possession and the Celtics won the game 118-116. On the night, Wilkins dropped 47 points, 5 rebounds, and 3 assists, while his teammate Doc Rivers had 16 points and 18 assists. Larry Bird finished with 34 points, 6 assists, and 4 rebounds, as he added this epic performance to his already legendary resume. The 76ers and Celtics in the 1981 Eastern Conference Finals. This was an epic matchup between the 2 best players in the Eastern Conference, Larry Bird and Julius Erving. At one point, the Celtics were down 3-1 in the series, yet they had stormed back to force a 7th game, as Larry Bird was determined to win his first championship ring. With a trip to the NBA Finals on the line, both of these extremely talented teams put forth their best efforts. In total, 7 Hall of Famers were competing in this fantastic game. Once again, this game was a prime example of referees putting away their whistles and letting the team settle the score for themselves. The game was fast-paced, but it was also quite intense from a physical standpoint. Neither team was lacking in the energy department, as the hustle plays were clearly on display from both sides. This game was also a block party, as a total of 16 shots were rejected on this evening, as no one was willing to give up any easy baskets. There were constant lead changes throughout the contest, and the energy in the building was some of the best playoff atmosphere that I've ever seen. Larry Bird was a beast defensively, and the Celtics needed a couple of clutch stops down the stretch. The game was tied at 89 with only a minute remaining, when Larry got a crucial stop on Daryl Dawkins. Bird then got the rebound and stormed down the court, where he hit the game-winning basket, in what was one of the most clutch sequences in playoff history. On the night, Dr. J had 23 points, 8 rebounds, 5 assists, and 4 blocks, while Larry Bird got the win with 23 points, 11 rebounds, 5 assists, and 5 steals. In this new Ultimate Team series, I make the best team I believe possible, picking players from all eras of NBA history. It isn't just about how talented the teams are, but I'm also trying to build teams that would gel and execute well together. Today, we're looking at the Ultimate Celtics team. Before I get started, here are the rules you need to know. To build each franchise's ultimate team, I will be picking a starting 5, a second unit representing each position, and then 3 additional rotation players at any position I choose. In total, there will be 13 roster spots. It's worth mentioning that I will not simply be building these teams based on how talented each player is, but I'll also be factoring in how well these players would do together as teammates. So without further ado, let's get into it. Starting at the point guard position is the 6'1" 4-time All-Star Rajon Rondo. I think a lot of people forget just how good this guy was in his prime. That's partially because of this weird dynamic where he was way younger than the Celtics' Big Three, so as Pierce, Garnett, and Allen were all declining, Rondo was only getting better. For a few years, he was actually sneaking his way into the conversation of the best point guards in the league, as he led the NBA in assists per game on 3 separate occasions, getting as high as 11.7 in 2012. He was also an elite defensive player, who was regularly among the league leaders in steals per game, and he earned 4 All-Defense Team selections. Don't forget how he was one of the most clutch players in the entire league, regularly putting up jaw-dropping stat lines in the playoffs. With so many offensive weapons in this starting lineup, they'll all be eating well with a prime Rondo doing the orchestrating. Starting at shooting guard is the 6'5" legend John Havlicek. This former superstar is certainly worthy of a spot on this starting unit, as he was an 8-time NBA champion, a 13-time All-Star, and made 11 All-NBA teams. He was also the very definition of a two-way player, as he made 8 All-Defense teams while filling up the stat sheet on offense. Specifically, in 1971, he averaged 29 points, 9 rebounds, and 7 assists on 45% shooting from the field. Simply put, he had all-around offensive skills that were way ahead of his time, and Bill Russell often leaned upon Havlicek to carry the offense for the Celtics. He was also quite the clutch performer, and was even the Finals MVP in 1974. Rondo will certainly love feeding this legend the basketball on a frequent basis. Starting at the small forward spot is, of course, Larry Bird. What is there to say about this legend that you guys don't already know? Bird was excellent at just about everything on the court. He was the epitome of efficient, as he was regularly getting around 50-40-90 percentages. He was an elite scorer, he was an all-time great rebounder, he was one of the greatest passing forwards in NBA history, and he was an underrated defensive player, making 3 All-Defense teams, including 3rd place in the DPOY race in 1983. So far, every single player in this starting unit is basically the definition of clutch, which shouldn't be totally surprising considering how many championship banners they have. Starting at power forward is the man they called the torture chamber, Kevin McHale. You could certainly make an argument for a different starting power forward, but due to his chemistry with Bird, I thought he'd be perfect with this group. The 6'10" McHale probably had the greatest footwork for a big in league history by any player not named Hakeem Olajuwon. In the post with his back to the basket, he was nearly unstoppable, and he was ridiculously efficient, as he had the highest single-season scoring average in NBA history for any player who shot at least 60% from the field and 80% from the free throw line. Continuing the theme of this squad so far, he was a remarkable two-way player, as his rumored 8-foot-long wingspan made him an intimidating defensive force in the paint, and because of that, he actually earned 6 All-Defense Team selections in his time in Boston. Starting at the center position is the game's ultimate winner, Bill Russell. As if this team didn't have enough defense already, in comes Bill Russell, who led the league in defensive win shares in 10 out of his 13 seasons. Along with the fact that he was probably the greatest defensive player of all time, he was also a top 3 rebounder, who would regularly dominate the boards thanks to his tremendous strength, IQ, and his world-class leaping ability. He was also a solid passer and a remarkably unselfish team player, which will be fantastic for this ultimate squad, with plenty of talent and plenty of egos. I know this word is getting redundant, but Russell was about as clutch as it gets, as he won all 10 of the Game 7s he participated in, which is a major reason why he got his 11 championship trophies. Now let's move on to the second unit. The backup point guard is the man known as the Houdini of the hardwood, Bob Cousy. This legend from the 1950s and 60s was the mesmerizing floor general of his time. Even with the more restrictive dribbling rules of his era, he had a fantastic handle of the basketball and incredible court vision. He actually led the NBA in assists per game for a whopping 8 straight seasons, which is easily the most in NBA history. His one major flaw was actually a flaw of his era, and that was the fact that he had a terrible field goal percentage, as the general basketball player was learning proper mechanics of the jump shot, and sometimes they didn't even jump. Because of this, Cousy would not look to be a scorer in this second unit, but that won't be a concern as he'll have plenty of elite offensive weapons to facilitate too. The backup shooting guard is the Celtics scoring superstar Paul Pierce. When people think of Pierce at his absolute best, they usually think of his finals MVP performance in the 2008 finals. But the thing is, that was actually well after his individual prime, as the younger Pierce had much more speed and explosiveness. He got as high as 26.9 points per game in 2006, getting the majority of those points as a one-on-one nightmare for opposing defenders. The Truth will provide this second unit with some all-time great slashing and great three-point shooting, while being a solid go-to option in late-game situations. The backup small forward will be the modern 6'8" superstar Jason Tatum. For any reason, if the ultimate Celtics ever need a scoring spark off the bench, this man will be a lock to provide it, as he was a 30 points per game scorer in the 22-23 season. Alongside of Paul Pierce, second unit defenses will be completely overwhelmed by this perimeter attack. Tatum also gives Cousy another decent three-point shooter to facilitate too, which will be a tremendous help for spacing for this squad. The backup power forward is the one they call the big ticket, Kevin Garnett. This guy will be battling with Kevin McHale for the majority of the minutes at the 4 spot, and McHale will certainly have his hands full trying to keep his starting spot, as Garnett was the Defensive Player of the Year immediately in his first season with Boston. KG will provide a tremendous amount of energy, intensity, and leadership on the defensive end of the floor, but he'll also be making a tremendous impact on the boards. Although his prime days were certainly in Minnesota, there's no question that the Boston version of Garnett was still a massive difference maker. The backup center will be the 1973 MVP, Dave Cowens. This 6'9" beast was averaging around 20 points and 15 rebounds throughout his prime, as he did a solid job of taking the torch from Bill Russell as the anchor of the team down low. Now on this ultimate unit, he'll be doing more of the same, as he'll be taking over the center position in the rare instances where Bill Russell actually has to go to the bench. In total, Cowens was an 8-time All-Star with the Celtics, and he made 3 All-Defense teams, further bolstering this team's greatest strength. Now, onto the 3 rotation spots. And let me tell you, narrowing down these 3 final roster spots was incredibly difficult. The first rotation spot goes to one of the greatest shooters of all time, Ray Allen. I absolutely hated the fact that Allen wasn't a starter or in the official second unit. But if anything, that just speaks to the ridiculous depth of the wings for the ultimate Celtics. If there's ever a time where Boston is desperate for effective perimeter shooting, then Allen will come into the game absolutely gunning it. He'll always be an option whenever the team is looking for ways to open up the floor and create more scoring opportunities. The next rotation player is the 6'4" shooting guard, Sam Jones. Imagine winning 10 championship rings as often the #1 scoring option on your squad, yet you're reduced to a rotation spot on the ultimate squad. That is the depth of this Celtics team. Jones was so far ahead of his time, as he had a smooth pull-up jumper and absolutely loved to run the pick and roll with Bill Russell. On several occasions, Jones would explode for 50-point games in the playoffs, which allowed the all-time great Bill Russell to focus all of his energy on defense and rebounding. On a team that has no shortage of defense, Jones will be a massive boost of offense off the bench. The last rotation spot goes to the 9-time All-Star Robert Parrish. This 7'1" star was a pivotal part of the Celtics dynasty in the 1980s. At his best in 1982, he was averaging nearly 20 points and 11 rebounds, and thanks to his consistent contributions, he was able to win 3 championship rings with the team. He's gonna have a hard time finding minutes with Bill Russell and Dave Cowens ahead of him, but with a few opportunities he'll get, the painted area will be in good hands. So here's a final look at the complete roster of the ultimate Celtics team. The defensive strength on this roster is utterly terrifying, and the IQ and experience on this team is insane as well, as they're loaded with winners and clutch performers. When it's all said and done, this may just be the greatest ultimate team of them all, but we'll have to finish this series before anything becomes official. Here is my long list of honorable mentions for this franchise. I gotta admit, it kinda makes me sick to my stomach that guys like Dennis Johnson and JoJo White had to be left off the roster. But seriously, who the hell was I supposed to replace? It's simply a near impossible roster to happily finalize. But with that being said, let me know how you would shake up the roster if the decision making was up to you. The greatest all-around player of all time. What does this mean exactly? When we're talking about this subject, I think most people mean it in terms of a variety of elite abilities. Is he a top scorer, a top passer, a top rebounder, a top defender, and so on? Usually, when this debate comes up, you'll hear 2 players get mentioned quite a bit: LeBron James and Michael Jordan. Let me make this clear. This video is not intended to be a criticism against either of those players. Both Jordan and LeBron are immensely talented in a variety of ways, and each of those players have a legitimate argument for that title. But the thing is, I think Larry Bird's case is just as strong, but for some reason, he's almost never given that same level of recognition on this particular topic. Now let me break down the main reasons why I think Bird's case is so strong. For one, Larry Bird has no weaknesses in his game. Think about how rare that actually is, even when considering some of the GOAT candidates. It can be argued that Michael Jordan's weakness was his 3-point shooting, especially earlier in his career. LeBron James is a below-average free throw shooter. Magic Johnson wasn't a great defensive player. Wilt Chamberlain and Shaquille O'Neal were terrible free throw shooters. In several seasons, Kobe Bryant wasn't very efficient from the field, and Bill Russell was a very limited scorer. On the other hand, Larry Bird was an elite scorer overall. He was tremendously efficient from the field, from 3-point range, and from the free throw line. He was an elite rebounder, especially considering his position. He was an elite passer, he was a clutch performer, and he was an NBA All-Defender. I challenge you to find one thing that Larry Bird wasn't good at. The other major reason is Larry was arguably a top 10 player of all time in several major categories. First off, scoring. When you consider the greatest scorers in NBA history and factor in a player's scoring efficiency, Larry Bird simply has to be in that conversation. He had a career scoring average of 24.3, which is only slightly behind the career scoring average of Kobe Bryant. He also has the second most 50-40-90 seasons in NBA history, trailing only Steve Nash, and Nash was never the 25 to 30 points per game player that Bird usually was. Over a 5-year stretch, from 1985 to 1989, Larry Bird averaged 28 points on 50-40-90 percentages. That level of sustained scoring efficiency is basically unmatched by the rest of NBA history. So again, he's arguably a top 10 scorer of all time. He's also arguably a top 10 rebounder in NBA history, when you consider the position he played. According to StatMuse, among small forwards, Bird has the 4th highest rebounds per game average in NBA history at 10.1. The thing is, every other player in the top 8 spots all played in the 1960s, which was easily the most inflated rebounding era in the game's history, and that was due to lower field goal percentages and a faster pace of play. The closest small forward to Larry Bird in rebounds per game who didn't play in the 1960s was Shawn Marion, who wasn't even close to Larry's numbers. He was able to accomplish this thanks to his 6'9" frame, thanks to his all-out play style, and because of his intelligence on the court. In clutch situations, he dominated the boards to an even greater extent. For goodness sake, in the 1984 NBA Finals, Bird averaged 14 rebounds per game over the course of the series, compared to the Lakers' Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who averaged 8.1. In the 1981 Finals, Bird averaged 15.3 rebounds, going toe-to-toe with the legendary rebounder Moses Malone. When you consider the era and the position he played, Bird is not only a top 10 scorer of all time, but he's also a potential top 10 rebounder of all time. Then you have Bird as a passer. He had creativity and court vision that was very nearly on the level of the great Magic Johnson. At times, it looked as if Bird had eyes in the back of his head with some of the passes he was making. Among small forwards, Larry has the 2nd highest assists per game average of all time, ahead of Scottie Pippen and trailing only LeBron James. But unlike LeBron James and Scottie Pippen, Bird's assists per game average actually increased in the postseason. When I recently did a video on the top 10 passers of all time, I had Bird as an honorable mention. And good lord, that created a whole bunch of backlash in the comments section. For me, he's in the 11 to 13 range. But at the very least, we can all agree that he's arguably a top 10 passer. Beyond that, there's 3-point shooting. Bird is tied for the most 3-point contest victories in NBA history with a total of 3, which he won in consecutive seasons. In the 1980s, he was regularly among the league leaders in both 3-point percentage and in 3-pointers attempted. He has every kind of 3-point shot in his arsenal, as he could hit them while off balance, he could pull up in transition, and he could catch and shoot. Throw in the fact that he was one of the most clutch 3-point shooters to ever live, and yeah, at the very least, Bird has an argument for being a top 10 3-point shooter. So to recap, he's arguably a top 10 scorer all time, a top 10 rebounder, a top 10 passer, and a top 10 3-point shooter. Now Bird is not a top 10 defensive player, but without a doubt in my mind, he's an extremely underrated defensive player. One thing he was known for was always giving his best energy and effort on the defensive end. You're going to be hard-pressed to find a substantial amount of footage of Bird being lazy on defense, as his blue-collar, grit-and-grind personality translated seamlessly to the court. Although he wasn't the fastest player on the court, he was extremely quick with his hands, as Bird was regularly among the league leaders in steals per game, as he averaged 1.7 over the course of his career. He was also an above-average shot blocker for his position, as he averaged 0.84 over the course of his career, which is actually a higher blocks per game average than proven defensive small forwards like LeBron James and Kawhi Leonard. Bird has 3 All-Defense Team selections on his resume, and even finished as high as 3rd overall in the Defensive Player of the Year rankings in 1983. If it wasn't for his humility, he would likely be the NBA's record holder for the most steals in a single game, seeing how he got a total of 9 in only 3 quarters against the Utah Jazz in 1985. Despite sitting out the 4th, Bird was just 1 steal shy of the illustrious quadruple-double. I promise, I'm not trying to convince you that he was basically Dennis Rodman on the defensive end. But at the very least, Bird was an elite defensive player who usually isn't recognized as such by modern fans. Again, To sum this all up, Larry Legend had basically no weakness in his game, while being top tier in many different aspects of the game. This is why I believe he has a formidable case for being the most complete basketball player in NBA history. There are some other candidates that I would consider as well. Guys like Michael Jordan, LeBron James, Kevin Durant, and Hakeem Olajuwon. But at the end of the day, when all things are considered, Bird might just be my ultimate choice. Today, I'm tackling a list that I've wanted to discuss for a while, the top 10 player-to-player rivalries in NBA history. Now obviously, there's no such thing as an objectively correct list when it comes to this kind of category, and there's a lot of different things to factor in when determining the list. So let me quickly skim over the different aspects I'll be considering when ranking this list. First is how often the rivals competed against one another. Second is the significance of the games when the rivals competed against one another. Third is how much the rivals personally dislike one another, especially when they were competing. And fourth, how good the players are certainly matters as well, because nobody gives a darn about two scrubs having a beef. So without further ado, let's get into it. Number 10, Larry Bird versus Julius Erving. As a rookie, Larry Bird was entering the NBA at the same time that Dr. J was in the prime of his career. Irving's 76ers were the established force in the Eastern Conference, while the Boston Celtics were the new rising power. These two teams met in the playoffs for the first 3 seasons of Bird's career, and 4 times in total. And there were some epic battles between the two biggest superstars in the conference. Even their regular season matches were intense. They looked like anything but friends when they had this famous altercation. Honestly, I contemplated having this rivalry even higher, but without question, it's certainly deserving of a spot in the top 10. Number 9. Kevin Durant versus Russell Westbrook. These two don't have the longest history of battles in the playoffs, as they've actually only met up once in the postseason as adversaries. But what they do have is many strong years together as teammates, before it all ended on a sour note, sparking one of the most famous beefs in modern history. There was name-calling, there was face-to-face jawing at one another, and there was must-see TV as both superstars were determined to destroy and embarrass each other in front of a live audience. These stars had nearly all the right ingredients for a top 5 rivalry, but without a deep history of playoff battles, they'll just have to settle for the 9th spot on the list. Number 8. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar versus Wilt Chamberlain. After many years battling against Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain was finally ready to have the center spotlight all to himself at the end of the 1969 season. But just then, a rookie Lou Alcindor, now Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, exploded onto the scene and became the new rival immediately. At first, the players were friendly and cordial towards one another, but both players were really outspoken about what they believe. And once they realized that they were on complete opposite ends of the political spectrum, their rivalry intensified. The two superstar giants met in the playoffs in 1971 and in 1972, and each legend won a round before ultimately winning the championship. It wasn't the longest lasting rivalry, seeing how Wilt retired after the completion of Kareem's 4th season, but regardless, it was intense while it lasted. Number 7. Larry Bird versus Isaiah Thomas. After ruling the 80s for the first half of the decade, the Celtics found themselves in many dogfights in the second half against the rising power in the conference, the bad boy Detroit Pistons. Without question, there was bad blood between the two teams, as there was always physical and intense interactions whenever they met up, which was incredibly often. Along with their regular season matches, the two teams met up 4 times in the East playoffs during the 80s. The rivalry was already strong, but Isaiah Thomas added fuel to the fire when he echoed Dennis Rodman's comments, saying that Larry Bird would be just another player if he wasn't white.
A very, very good basketball player. I think he's an exceptional talent, but I'd have to agree with Rodman. If he was black, he'd be just another good guy.
If there was any doubt that their bitterness was still strong, Bird just about confirmed it when he immediately fired Isaiah Thomas as the Indiana Pacers head coach the instant Bird took over as the general manager. Number 6. Kevin Garnett versus Tim Duncan. For a while, these two power forwards were in a heated battle for the title of the best at the position. Beyond that, they had met up twice in the Western Conference playoffs, with Duncan's Spurs winning both matchups. One of the interesting dynamics about their rivalry was the contrast in their personalities. Duncan was a quiet and reserved leader who led by example, while Garnett was about as vocal and animated as one person can be. As many of you viewers probably know, there is plenty of stories about the intense trash talk in this rivalry, which allegedly became very personal from Garnett. Number 5. Kobe Bryant versus Shaquille O'Neal. Famously, they spent 8 seasons together in Los Angeles and won 3 NBA championships as teammates. Yet even while they were wearing the same jersey, they still seemed like rivals at some points. Their split in 2004 was extremely toxic to say the least. Both players were making negative comments about one another to the media, and both players were determined to prove that they could win a championship without the other. Although they never met in the NBA playoffs as adversaries, without question, they accounted for some of the most highly anticipated regular season battles in NBA history, and they almost never disappointed. It was a unique rivalry in the sense that the two players didn't play against each other relatively as much. But after the split, there was certainly a competitive connection that the two could never disassociate from. One of the first things out of Shaq's mouth when he won his 4th championship was Kobe. And one of the first things out of Kobe's mouth when he won his 5th championship was Shaq. Number 4. LeBron James versus Steph Curry. Even recently, more pages have been added to the book of their rivalry. It started out in 2015 when they first met in the NBA Finals, but things really heated up the following year, when Steph Curry became the first unanimous MVP winner and even had some people claiming that he had replaced LeBron James as the new face of the NBA, just for LeBron to shut down that narrative emphatically in the 2016 Finals. In total, the stars have met up 5 times in the NBA playoffs, including 4 straight years in the NBA Finals. And despite the fact that they're now both in their late 30s, it's still up for grabs on who's walking away with a better career. Number 3. Michael Jordan versus Isaiah Thomas. There are rivalries where players have a fierce yet friendly competition. And then there are rivalries where you get the sense that both parties generally don't like one another. But Isaiah and Michael have a rivalry that's even more rare than that, as they have an obvious hatred that burns for one another many decades later. The Bad Boy Pistons famously implemented the Jordan rules, where they would physically punish MJ anytime he got close to the basket. Along with that, these two teams met up for 4 straight years in the NBA playoffs, with the Pistons winning the first 3 before Jordan's Bulls finally broke through in 1991. Then you have Isaiah getting eliminated and walking off the court without shaking hands with MJ. And you have MJ allegedly keeping Thomas off the 1992 Dream Team. This rivalry had the talent, the frequency, the stakes, and the necessary bitterness to give it a top 3 spot. Number 2. Wilt Chamberlain versus Bill Russell. It was one of the first superstar rivalries of NBA history, and thanks to the fact that it was 2 of the most athletically gifted centers of all time, it's been able to stand the test of time. These 2 legends accounted for 11 straight championships as they completely defined that era of basketball. Although they were friendly off the court, they were always competitive on it, with many moments becoming heated. Not only did this rivalry have the significance and talent categories, but the frequency was on a level of their own, as they would play against each other as many as 17 times a year between the regular season and the postseason. I imagine you gotta be getting pretty tired of your opponent at that point. Number 1. Magic Johnson versus Larry Bird. This rivalry completely defined the era of 1980s basketball, and it also saved the NBA from its tanking viewership. Two team-first, passionate competitors who were all consumed by the desire to best one another. Either Bird's Celtics or Magic's Lakers were in the NBA Finals every single season of that decade, and those two teams battled it out 3 times in the championship series. Some of the most memorable and iconic plays of NBA history came from that rivalry, and the league has been reaping the benefits ever since. Here's my list of honorable mentions. Should any of these rivalries have been in the top 10 instead? I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments section below. In this new Ultimate Team series, I make the best team I believe possible, picking players from all eras of NBA history. It isn't just about how talented the teams are, but I'm also trying to build teams that would gel and execute well together. Today, we're looking at the Ultimate Lakers team. Before I get started, here are the rules you need to know. To build each franchise's ultimate team, I will be picking a starting 5, a second unit representing each position, and then 3 additional rotation players at any position I choose. In total, there will be 13 roster spots. It's worth mentioning that I will not simply be building these teams based on how talented each player is, but I'll also be factoring in how well these players would do together as teammates. So without further ado, let's get into it. Starting at the point guard position is the face of Showtime, Magic Johnson. To many, and probably to most people, Magic is viewed as the greatest point guard of all time. One thing about this 6'9" floor general is that he really liked to push the tempo. The Showtime Lakers offense was ridiculously fast, and during his prime, he had guys who were solid at running in transition alongside of him. But especially on this Ultimate squad, they'll be even better on the fast break. Magic's best individual season was probably in 1987, while he was named the league MVP while averaging 24 points, 12 assists, and 6 rebounds on 52% shooting from the field. At the end of the day, there was basically no doubt on who was getting this starting nod. Starting at the shooting guard spot is the one known as the Black Mamba, Kobe Bryant. What's interesting is that Kobe never really played with a top-tier point guard in Los Angeles. Sure, Steve Nash was there for a bit, but that was long after Nash's prime. With Magic running the floor, Kobe will have to learn to play off ball, which will make this more like his time on the Olympic squads than anything else. Kobe ensures that this Ultimate team will have a late game closer, a consistent flow of offense, and an elite perimeter defender. At his best in the 05-06 season, the Mamba averaged a ridiculous 35 points while being first team all-defense. To this day, that is the highest scoring average while being first team all-defense. Starting at small forward is the still active legend LeBron James. Throughout the vast majority of his career in Los Angeles, LeBron has started at the point guard spot. But in this case, he'll have to make room for Magic and return to his more traditional position. This should be no issue for LeBron though, as he's one of the greatest transition players that the game has ever seen. Magic used to be dishing the ball to a streaking James Worthy at the small forward spot, and as effective as that was, a streaking LeBron will be even scarier. At his Los Angeles best in 2020, James averaged 25 points, 10 assists, and 8 rebounds on 49% shooting from the field. With Magic and LeBron on the floor simultaneously, there will never be a time where the open man goes unnoticed. Starting at power forward is the former all-time leading scorer Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He's always played at the center position, so starting the 7-2 captain at the 4 may seem crazy to some, but I actually think it makes perfect sense when you think about the way this team operates. For one, Kareem was especially great at running the floor with Magic, especially when he was younger in the early 80s. Also, Kareem's bread and butter is not to score from directly under the basket, but it's actually from the post, as he had the most indefensible shot of all time, the sky hook. At 7'2" with that shot, opposing power forwards will be begging for mercy. In 1981, Kareem put up 26 points, 10 rebounds, 3 assists, and 3 blocks on 57% shooting from the field. Starting at the center position is the Diesel Shaquille O'Neal. In LA is where Shaq was at his absolute peak form, as he had the perfect combination of power and athleticism. With Kareem in the post and with Kobe and LeBron on the wings, Shaq will experience the most single-man coverage that he's ever had in his life, and due to this, he'll almost certainly be shooting a career-high percentage in the paint. Quite frankly, that point about single-man coverage is probably applicable to every player in this starting unit, and not just Shaq. During his nearly unanimous MVP run in 2000, Shaq averaged roughly 30 points, 14 rebounds, 4 assists, and 3 blocks on a league-leading 57% shooting from the field. When you look at this starting unit of Magic, Kobe, LeBron, Kareem, and Shaq, some modern basketball fans might complain about the lack of elite three-point shooting. But honestly, I'm not sure how much that really matters if the starting unit is shooting 60% from two-point range basically every night. Now on to the second unit, which is definitely strong enough to beat most starting units. The backup point guard is the logo himself, Jerry West. Many people debate whether West should be considered as a 1 or a 2. But given the fact that he was the starting point guard during their dominant 1972 championship run, that's where I'm placing him. Although the three-point shot did not exist yet in the NBA during his career, West was a guy who certainly could have been lethal from that distance. Not only is he known as Mr. Clutch for his big game performances, but he was also one of the most underrated defenders of all time. In 1972, he averaged about 26 points, a league-leading 9.7 assists, and 4 rebounds on 48% shooting from the field. The backup shooting guard is the 6'1" Hall of Famer Gail Goodrich. Without question, he's one of the most underappreciated players in the franchise's history, as he was a legitimate superstar in his own right, yet almost never gets any shine in this modern day. He was a solid pull-up shooter and was often the recipient of Jerry West's numerous assists. In their 1972 championship run, he averaged 26 points, 4 assists, and 4 rebounds on an elite 49% shooting. He may be battling for minutes with all of these incredible guards, but he'll never be a bad option when he's on the court. The backup small forward is the dominant Elgin Baylor. To this day, he holds the NBA record for the most points scored in a finals game with a total of 61, which basically sums up just how explosive he was offensively. Beyond that, he was the greatest rebounder ever for a player his size, as he intelligently used his strength and IQ to be among the league leaders on a yearly basis. In the 1961 season, Baylor put up an insane average of roughly 35 points, 20 rebounds, and 5 assists on 43% shooting from the field. He'll be right at home when he's on the court with West, as they earn the nicknames Mr. Inside and Mr. Outside. The backup power forward is the versatile two-way threat Anthony Davis. As a superstar off the bench, AD will be able to stay healthy more often, and will even be able to focus more of his energy on the defensive end of the floor. With the incredible traditional centers on this squad, he'll have even less attention on him when he looks to go to work from the post. His LA best was in 2020, where he put up 26 points, 9 rebounds, 3 assists, and 2 blocks on 50% shooting from the field. The backup center is arguably the most dominant player in the history of the game, Wilt Chamberlain. Maybe the biggest concern for this team will be morale and chemistry, because imagine trying to convince an elite Wilt Chamberlain to come off the bench. Regardless, that will be his responsibility on this ultimate squad. By the time he was in Los Angeles, Wilt had taken a step back as a scorer, yet he was still a terrifying rim protector and an elite passer from the post and in outlet situations. In 1969, he averaged 20 points, a league-leading 21 rebounds, and 4 assists on 58% shooting from the field. I can only imagine the mismatches that Wilt will be taking advantage of as he faces backup centers on a nightly basis. Now on to the 3 rotation players. The first is the man known as Big Game James Worthy. This 6'9" small forward had one of the quickest first steps in basketball history, and as I mentioned before, he was extremely dangerous in transition. You would be wrong to assume that he was simply a role player, as Worthy was a legitimate star who could take over on his own. Case in point, he was the 1988 Finals MVP with one of the greatest Game 7 performances of all time. During his 7 straight All-Star seasons in LA, he averaged about 20 points, 5 rebounds, and 3 assists on 53% shooting from the field. The second rotation player is another Hall of Famer, Pau Gasol. This 7-foot center / power forward helped Kobe Bryant win back-to-back championships in 2009 and 2010. He did it with his finesse-style offense and with his unselfish team play. In 2010, Pau put up 18 points, 11 rebounds, and 3 assists on 54% shooting from the field. He's yet another player on this absurdly stacked roster that will struggle to get a tremendous amount of minutes, but when he's in, he'll be a safe bet to produce. The third rotation player and the last spot on this roster goes to the role-playing shooting guard Michael Cooper. There is certainly more talented and more accomplished players who could have taken this spot, but with these last few bench spots, I'm looking for guys who can fill needed roles. There is enough superstar power on this roster, and what's needed is some 3-point shooting and defense. This 6'7" wing just happens to be one of the greatest 3-and-D players of all time. He made an insane 8 all-defense teams in Los Angeles, and for a while, he was a 3-point record holder in the NBA Finals. He was also insanely athletic, and was with all 5 championship teams in the 80s, proving that he has the playoff experience to belong. So here's a final look at the complete roster of this Ultimate Lakers team. Simply put, there is no weaknesses on this squad, as they are absurdly overpowered. The different rotations and lineups that could dominate are pretty much endless. When we eventually do the 2K simulation of all the teams, this team will likely be the favorite heading in. They'll probably still find a way to lose in the first round just because 2K is ridiculous like that. But in a more realistic scenario, it's hard to envision this team ever being stopped. My one major frustration with this roster is the fact that George Mikan isn't on it, but I honestly don't see what impact he could have had when there's so many great bigs ahead of him, which is why I ultimately went with Cooper for the final spot. Here is my list of honorable mentions. Should any of these players have made the roster instead, I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comment section below. Thanks for watching as always, make sure to like and subscribe for more basketball content, and I'll see you guys in the next video.